welcome to Bible Month Training Day 2023. We are so pleased that you can join us. We're here in Salisbury Methodist Church this morning. We thank the guys that we can use this building to be Zoomed to you in your church, in your front room. And we're really thankful that you are joining us today. Today we'll be exploring a world full of imagery and message. In so many ways, a land of revision of the themes of the Bible, of our Bibles, of love and of life. An exciting day with amazing lineup of contributors. And we're so thankful to them as they engage into today. A day which we hope will help all of us understand and be able to lead and preach from this book in a more clear and confident way. But we want you to engage with us too in a very tangible way. Today we want you to be engaging with us by asking questions to our contributors on things that may be prompted in your mind, the questions that you have from the book of Revelation. The number that we want you to be calling to engage with us is on your screens right now. So I'm just going to read it if I can look at it. It's 07969 985 376. That number may appear again very soon. Remember that in the usual kind of strictly way, do ask the person that pays the bills if you can use a mobile phone to connect with us today, and the usual rates will apply and you will be charged. We are relying on the power of the internet today, and so we just ask that you bear with us. We've already had a little bit of a problem this morning, but we intend that that will not be a problem throughout today. So we ask that if something were to go down, you're just patient, we all breathe, and hopefully by the magic of the tech people, we will be back online very soon. Today, let me lead you through what we will be discovering today. Okay, shortly, we are going to have session 1, Reading Revelation with Michael Wadsworth. And a really engaging time of us really getting into the scripture. After a break, we will have session 2 with Jasmine Davidson and Michael Wadsworth, having a conversation about how we preach from the book of Revelation. Now, this is a bit of a change to what we had planned, because sadly, Jasmine isn't with us in Salisbury Methodist today because she's snowed in at home. So she is going to be zoomed in, but they're still going to be able to engage in a conversation, so that's great. Then we will have some lunch. Oh no, I forgot. We will be having then some questions and answers. And that is the point at which I really do need your questions, because else they'll just be mine. So please do text those in. After lunch, we'll be joined by Gail Adcock in a session called Enacting Revelation. She'll be helping us to engage with the scriptures in ways of all age, helping people to engage with the imagery of Revelation. And then session 4 is with Lawrence Waring from Singing the Faith. And he'll be talking to us about the impact Revelation has had on hymns and songs throughout the years, and how that can be used within our services. We're really looking forward to today and all the things that we have planned. And I really hope that today is a day where you will feel more confident to go out and preach and lead from the book of Revelations going forward. I hope to, certainly. We continue our day with devotions, asking God for his guiding spirit to help us all. You know, the Bible is full, the book of Revelations is full of that creative imagination. What incredible images are in the book. Golden lampstands, a mighty figure, stars and flames, rivers and trees, and even a dragon appears. It conjures an awesome picture in this letter that John is writing to the 7 churches. Each church has its own experience. Some are comfortable, others are being persecuted, and there is something to say to each one, as there is today. As we explore Revelation, we'll think about what this final book of the New Testament says to the church today. The all-age material that you'll find in the books that accompany this training provides for the all-age worship. You'll see that material helpfully uses the images and symbols, as well as encouraging us to use our human senses to connect with God and his message for the church today. So with that in mind and using our senses, I lead us in a prayer of dedication of today. Father God, at the start of Revelation, we read, "Blessed are those who hear." I invite us all to be quiet, to be still, to tune in to the small voice of God. We leave our distractions, aware of our responsibilities. Lord God, we ask that you speak to us, whether that be through word or picture. A few verses on, you say, "Every eye will see him." We imagine, Jesus, you are beside us today. What are you saying to us in our vocation, in our passion, in our preaching and leading? Come, say the Spirit and the bride. Whoever hears, echo, come. Is anyone thirsty? Come. All who will come and drink. Drink freely of the water of life. Throughout today, let us dive deeper into the streams of your word, Lord, that we might have confidence to go and proclaim the goodness of your flow of grace, mercy, and love. Amen. Amen. Thank you for joining with us. We hope that it is a day of true engagement. We ask that you continue to text us on that number. I don't know if we can have that number back on the screen. And please do just help us engage with you as we go through today. So I'm going to hand over to our first contributor, Michael Wadsworth, who's going to lead us with session 1 about reading Revelation. Michael.
Bridget. Hello everyone, it's really good to be virtually with you this morning. I'm excited for what we've got ahead. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael. I work for the Learning Network based up in the Eastern region, and with a small team of others, I'm responsible for helping make Bible Month a thing, make it happen, take a lead on it on behalf of the Connection. And I love the book of Revelation. I'm not going to lie about that. I feel like I need to start on that vote of confidence. I think this is an amazing text. I think it's a fantastic resource, actually, to the church, but I think it's an underrated one. My love affair with Revelation began probably about 6 years ago when I was asked to produce a 10, 12-week teaching series on it for the church I was working for as a teaching pastor at the time. And I'll be fully honest with you, I was really nervous about it. I did not feel up to the task at all. I kind of went into it real trepidation. But I quickly found a whole load of resources that really made it a much easier to grapple with text than I thought it was going to be. And actually, as I engaged with those and as I read it through, I thought, gosh, this is a really profound and relevant message, actually, that I've continued to read and glean a lot out of for my own personal discipleship over the last 6 years. So it's kind of my fault, I'm afraid, that we're doing it for Bible Month this year. And you may be asking why. You may be thinking, why have, the 65 other books that are really good, why have we chosen Revelation? Well, partly it's fascinating, let's be honest. There's a level of intrigue about it. And I think it's become increasingly fascinating over the last few years. I think other people, particularly around COVID times, when there's a lot of stuff kicking off around the world, I think people start to think back about some of what they've read or kind of heard about Revelation, and it's kind of dropped into the cultural zeitgeist a little bit. And so I think there is a fascination with it, which is worth us kind of exploring and taking advantage of. Partly, I think it's really good for us to engage with because we're tempted to avoid it. And because there's a lack of familiarity about it, I think that gives us a real advantage to go, hey, if I'm not familiar with a part of the Bible, which is God's gift to us as a means of understanding who God is, then surely I want to be able to grapple with it myself. Surely, actually, I want to plow into it rather than just avoid it. Otherwise, we might miss out on something that God has on offer for us. And the other thing is, I do think what it has to offer is loads of practical wisdom and pastoral care for us in our ongoing discipleship. I think ultimately it is a message from a pastoral sage to a group of kind of messy and passionate, but kind of a bit all over the place Christians and churches, which, if I'm honest, kind of sounds a bit like us today as well, doesn't it? Sometimes we're not quite sure what's going on and we feel a bit pulled here, there, and everywhere. And Revelation is written to a group of people just like that, which means I think we can receive a lot of wisdom and comfort and insight from it. So that's why we're tackling it. I do want to start by acknowledging that it is a bit of a theological boogeyman. It is one of those texts that has a bad reputation. It is one of those texts that people might be nervous of or have a bit of a fear around. And I fully and wholeheartedly appreciate that. But I think it's a little bit like a Scooby-Doo villain. I feel like it's actually quite a normal thing that gets masked by a load of bad readings. And actually, when you pull the mask off, when you take off those bad readings and you start engaging with it like you would most other biblical books, you actually realize there's nothing really to be scared of at all. It's just the janitor. It's that kind of Scooby-Doo dynamic. I found this quote from Brian McLaren really helpful in painting the picture of what Revelation is for us. So I'm just going to read this. Everything in Revelation can be found in the previous 65 books of the Bible. It actually adds nothing of substance to what we already know. I read Revelation not to get more information, but instead to revive my imagination. St. John uses words the way poets do, recombining them in fresh ways so that old truth is freshly perceived. He takes truth that has been eroded by platitude, by endless usage, and sets it in motion before us in an animated and impassioned dance of ideas. I think that's a really good description of the book. That it's not giving us new things, it's not actually kind of massively crazy ideas about the future. Most of it is building on ideas and assumptions and truth that we discover in the rest of the Bible. It's just sometimes actually it's buried under bad readings or misunderstandings. So my plan over the next hour or so is to try and help you as you start to read the text. And what I want to do is demonstrate its normalcy, really. I want to work through it like we would any other book of the Bible, bring in the same kind of skills, the same lenses, the same understandings that we would to any other text. And then I think as we kind of followed the exegesis framework, if I can use that technical term, hopefully it will come alive to you. Hopefully you'll feel better equipped to explore it, to read it for yourself, and then moving forwards to preach on it and to lead worship around it too. So I'm going to pick up on different elements of the exegetical process. I'm going to explore how they help us grapple with different passages in Revelation. And I want to start with our standard assumptions. So any time we open up the Bible, what are some of the assumptions that we bring to the table? Well, firstly, surely our primary assumption has to be that this is God's gift to us. The Bible is something that we have received through which we encounter God, that the Holy Spirit can breathe life on the words on the page and bring them alive in us. It is part of the canon, and it is actually meant to be understood. The very fact that it's called a revelation is because it's meant to reveal something to us. It's not actually meant to be shrouded in mystery. It's not actually meant to be kind of something which we struggle to come to terms with or to engage with or understand. But at the same time, the other assumption we have to bring is the recognition that it's a 2,000-year-old document. Anytime we open up the Bible, whether it's Revelation or whether it's Genesis or whether it's Isaiah as it was last year or whether it's one of the Gospels, we're always engaging in some form of cross-cultural exploration. We're always actually approaching something that we are unfamiliar with, we're slightly alien to, we're historically removed from it, we're culturally removed from it, we're linguistically removed from it, we're geographically removed from it. You know, it emerged in a different time, place, and world and context. But that doesn't mean that we can't come to terms with it and learn to understand it. It just might take a little bit of work. And thankfully, we have a raft of scholarship. We have a raft, we stand on the shoulders of giants that have come before us, and we can build on their understanding and rely on the Holy Spirit as we approach the text. So it is there for us to understand. It might require a little bit of something of us. But finally, the other assumption I just want us to bring to text is that it's genius. One of the reasons I am passionate about the Bible is because every time I read it, I'm amazed by how clever the writers are, how interwoven the text is, by how artistic it is as a document. And so we want to kind of sit with the genius. We don't just want to kind of plow on through the art gallery of beauty that is the canon of Scripture, but actually we want to pause in front of each work and take our time to engage and to understand and to appreciate the nuances and the subtleties. And that's actually what Bible Month is all about. Each year, taking a different text and grappling with its genius and appreciating what it offers us on its own terms in the full gallery of the canon of Scripture. The other thing that we want to bring as we start off is we're going to begin by asking the standard questions. What are the normal things that we just ask of every text when we open up? We've had the standard assumptions, but what are the standard questions? Well, one of the first questions we may often find ourselves asking as we open up a book of the Bible is, who's the author? And we get an idea of who the author is in Revelation pretty early on. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, we get, I, John. So it's written by someone called John. That's helpful. But we don't get much more detail than that. That is one of the challenges that we have. Which John? Is it John the disciple? Is it John the apostle? Is it the same John that wrote the Gospels or the letters? Is it John the elder or another John? And actually, scholars can't make up their minds. There's lots of debates about that. There's lots of different opinions that fly around out there. I always want to ask the question, does it matter? Actually, is it going to change the way that I read or interpret the text? It's very clear when you read Revelation that I think the writer is familiar with the other Johannine literature. There's definitely, it picks up on some of the ideas or the imageries or the language that is in John's Gospel, or certainly the letter of 1 John. But does it matter? It's a little bit of an unknown, but I think, we can probably just continue to take the text on its own terms and still appreciate that it has something to offer us, whether we know who wrote it or not. Another question we often ask as we open up a text for the first time is, when was it written? And again, when it comes to Revelation, this is a tricky question. Again, there's lots of debates in scholarship around whether it was early, whether it was late, was it pre-AD 70, was it more like AD 96-ish, was it during the reign of Emperor Nero, was it during the reign of Emperor Domitian? And actually, again, I want to ask, well, does it really matter? Is it really going to change up how I read and interpret this too much, whether it was, 30 years before, 30 years after, whatever? I think it's better for us to take the text on its own terms and read it theologically and ask not what claims it's making about, the Greco-Roman context of the early church in AD 60 or 90, but to say what claims is it making about God? And as hopefully we'll discover as we go through the text, that's a much more pertinent question. Another question we often ask as we open up text for the first time is, who was this written to? And again, that's possibly a slightly more helpful question. We get a pretty clear idea, actually, that in chapters 2 and 3, we get these letters to the 7 churches spread across Asia Minor, modern-day kind of Turkey. So that it is written to those people, and it is a message for them to grapple with what does it look like for us to be Christian churches in our place and time in history. What does it look like for us to wrestle with the kind of the cultural dynamics going on, the things that are kicking off around us? But at the end of each of the letters, you get this beautiful refrain, and Bridget's already referenced it this morning in our devotions, of anyone who has ears, let them hear. So we receive this, and thankfully I've got ears, and I'm listening out, and it's something which I think we can receive, that the broader Christian church in the first century was meant to receive. It is something for us. One of the reasons why this is a helpful thing for us to recognize is that because it was written to 7 churches in the first century, first of all, it probably means that some of the imagery can't be translated as things like Apache helicopters, because that would have meant nothing to them in the first century. So it's helpful for us to recognize that everything that we read, we probably need to read on the terms as a first century document, but we can still learn from it, we can still take its ideas, take its theological claims, and apply them to ourselves today. Finally, a really helpful question for us to ask as we engage with Revelation is, what's the genre at play? And this, I think, is going to be the key to starting to unlock the text for those of us who are less familiar with it. What kind of literature am I reading? Now, we're very used to discerning on the basis of very simple cues what kind of genre of writing or storytelling we're engaging with. So if I was to say to you something like, an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scottishman walked into a bar, most of you would probably assume that what followed was going to be a joke, not a very important historical account of something that was happening. Or if I was to begin a sentence with, once upon a time, you're probably going to assume that what is going to follow is some kind of fairy story. It might have meaning, but it's something slightly different than, again, like a straight proverb. Or if I was to say something like, back in my day, you might think, okay, well, what's going to follow is something which is a historical account, but it's one that is shrouded in a particular person's opinion and perspective and way of thinking about that. And we pick up on these little verbal cues, and we instantly reposture ourselves to what follows accordingly. Now, what's not very helpful is the fact that Revelation is multiple genres all mixed up together. So firstly, it is a letter, as I've said, to a specific people at a specific time. And we get that early on in chapter 1, we get the language of, I, John, to the 7 churches. So already, straight away, we have the language of letter going on in Revelation. We then very quickly actually pick up the fact that it's also a prophetic writing. You get these accounts of what God is saying. You get the imagery of Jesus being portrayed. And it's sort of similar to what we were looking at in Isaiah last year for Bible Month. So there's prophetic language in there as well, which, remember from last year, is often more about forthtelling, offering a perspective on what's going on at the time of writing, rather than foretelling, predicting what's going to happen further down the line. But a third genre, which is particularly at play in the book of Revelation, is a language of apocalypsis, which is a Greek word that basically means unveiling. It's this idea of pulling back the curtain on heaven and enabling people to see what's going on in the spiritual realm, which helps us understand what's going on in the realm that we can see. And this is a really unfamiliar genre to us, but it was a really well-known genre in the first century. There are lots and lots of apocalyptic books around kind of the first century, actually from the 4th century BC onwards. And we get other glimpses of this genre at work elsewhere in the Bible. We get it in Ezekiel, we get it in Daniel, we get it elsewhere too. And although it's unfamiliar to us, it was super familiar to the original readers. So they would reposture themselves to what followed accordingly. And one of the things that gets lost in translation in Revelation, one of the main reasons we struggle with it, is because we don't know how to posture ourselves to that genre. I think one of the most helpful ways that we can think about the genre of apocalypse is actually to compare it maybe to political cartoons, something we are a little bit more familiar with. Political cartoons are often caricatured. They're often crude. They can sometimes be quite grotesque. They are intended to provoke. They're satirical. They're clumsy. And they always make use of the cultural context and imagery that is relevant to those who they're communicating to as well. So I'm going to put a political cartoon on the screen, and then I'm going to read you a piece of apocalyptic language that I've written about it. Then I saw a woman dressed in black like medieval armor, limping towards the edge of a cliff. She was holding the great sword of democracy, but with it she'd cut off her own arms and legs, leaving herself unstable and bleeding. Yet despite these mortal wounds and the doom ahead of her, she remained defiant, insisting she would fight on. Now that's obviously a piece of satire. It's a political cartoon built around Theresa May, post-Brexit, and her trying to figure out what does it look like for me to be the Premier of kind of Britain post-Brexit, something she didn't vote for, and trying to help juggle what it meant for her to lead in that context. And the imagery there plays heavily on the scene of the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Now, if you're not familiar with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and if you're not familiar with Theresa May and post-Brexit Britain, and if you hadn't seen that image, you just heard those words, you might think, good grief, what's going on here? And you would be right to do so. But when you understand the kind of the genre of political cartoon, and when you understand the context, actually it's not very hard to appreciate what's going on. And that's what's happening with apocalyptic literature, and that's what's happening with much of Revelation. And that's part of the work that we have to put in order to engage with the genius in front of us. So let's dive into the text, shall we? Now, our first stage in exegesis is to talk about the text itself. We always begin with the words on the page. We always start with, what can I see in front of us? What do I notice as I begin to read? And actually, this might seem like an obvious statement to make, but actually it's an element that I think is underrated. It's something that I think people miss. If I was to talk about Revelation to you, your mind might instantly go to things like the Left Behind series and the image of the Antichrist and the rapture. Now, the problem is the Antichrist doesn't feature anywhere in Revelation. The problem is that the rapture doesn't actually happen in Revelation. That's a reference to Thessalonians. The Antichrist appears in the letter 1 John. So often we think about Revelation, but we already go straight to stuff that isn't even in the text itself. So let's try and be disciplined as we approach this and think, okay, what is actually on the words, within the words on the page? I think an underrated question we ask, or should ask, when we're reading the text is, how does it make me feel? Going back to Brian McLaren's thing, actually, if it makes you feel, if it spins your imagination off, that's probably because the text is trying to do that. If it makes you feel uncomfortable, that might be because the text is trying to do that. If it makes you feel excited, it might be because the text is trying to do that. Remember, the writers are genius. They're trying to invoke something in us. And actually, it's a really helpful question just for you to clock, even as you start reading. What am I feeling as I'm reading? What am I noticing as I'm reading? What's happening within me as I read? Another question we want to ask as we look at the text is, what are the key themes and ideas that I'm beginning to notice? A major theme in Revelation, again, probably underappreciated, is Jesus. Actually, the whole of it begins the revelation of Jesus Christ. Primarily what John is trying to do with the whole book is to reveal something about the nature of Jesus to us. This is actually more like a gospel than we care to kind of give it credit for. It's about Jesus, it's about his authority, it's about his power, it's about his victory, it's about his followers. It's all really about Jesus, which is why, in chapter 1, you get that amazing imagery around kind of Jesus standing there and his feet are like bronze and his face is shining like the sun in all of its glory. And it's powerful imagery, and I'd encourage you to kind of read and reflect and get lost in that. Another theme or idea that we find in Revelation is that of power claims. There's lots of people in Revelation, or there's lots of things in Revelation that compete with Jesus for authority and for power and for victory and for followers. That's another theme that we notice. There's loads in there about faith and faithfulness. Actually, Revelation primarily is a letter encouraging a group of Christians to persevere in their faith, and it talks to them about what that looks like in quite practical terms. The final exhortation of Revelation is, be holy, do right, and come to the Lord. And it repeats that a number of times. That ultimately is what the end point of the text is all about. Be holy, do right, come to the Lord Jesus. Which is a message that we probably find ourselves sharing from the pulpit week in, week out, right? Or hopefully we are. The other theme that we will notice, and you can't escape in Revelation, is the theme of judgment. But again, we want to attend to the words on the page. What kind of judgment? Who is the judgment brought against? What is this judgment really about? And I would argue and contend that the more you read Revelation, the more you realize that the judgment really comes against those anti-God powers and principalities, not primarily humanity. And we'll talk about that later down the line this morning too. So there are some of the key themes and ideas. We also want to talk about some of the characters at play in Revelation that we encounter in the text. One of the first things you'll notice is there's very clear and obvious contrast drawn between goodies and baddies. There are goodies, there's Jesus, there's the Lamb, there's the kind of the followers of the Lamb, and then there's the baddies, there's the dragon, there's the beasts, there's the followers of the beasts. What I find really interesting is that the big leaders, if you like, the big rulers that we encounter are all talked about in quite cosmic, metaphorical, imaginative terms. So we've already talked about Jesus appearing with bronze feet and a face shining like the sun and hair like white wool. And we encounter these beasts and they have many heads and different horns and, they look all kind of weird and crazy. And I think it's worth us noticing that we should be honing in on the fantastical imagery around that and asking, well, why are they being described in these ways? It's interesting that when we encounter, say, the beast from the sea in Revelation chapter 13, they look like they've been slain, but they're still alive. And if you read those words and you think, oh, that kind of really reminds me of Jesus, well, you'd be right to do so. The point is that the beast looks like a false Messiah. It looks like someone who claims to be in charge. It looks like someone who claims to be good and someone you want to pledge your allegiance to. But actually, we need to be nervous of them. The land beast, similarly, is given power to breathe ruach, breathe life into the images of the beast from the sea. And you might think, well, that sounds a lot like the Holy Spirit. And you'd be right to think that. There's something going on in the imagery that says, hey, there are false political powers and false religious powers out there that will vie for your attention. And do you see how because of the cosmic language that's going on, because of the creative imagery that's going on, we're actually invited to start thinking through, okay, well, what might that look like in my context? What might those false political powers or those false religious powers look like in my context? And the fact that these rulers are described in cosmic terms enables us to dive into that imagery and explore it for ourselves in our own context. In contrast, the followers of these fantastical leaders are described in very human terms. You have the 7 churches who are, churches, just groups of people that we know. We have people robed in white singing. We have sailors and we have merchants. We have kings of the earth. We have people who seem like everyday people. And actually, I think that's really powerful and insightful, because I think what we're invited to do is then see ourselves, us, normal people, in the text too. To recognize that even as we're trying to grapple with what are the cosmic forces in play in our world, what does it look like for me as a normal person to live and respond to that? I think that's part of the genius of the writing of Revelation. Another thing you might notice as you engage with the text are various patterns at play. And again, I mean, I could get lost in this because it's super fun and super geeky. But again, part of the genius, and another clue actually to the genre of what we're reading. There's too much rhythm and too much order in Revelation for us to take it fully literally. So one of the first things you'll notice is patterns of 7. So you have 7 churches, and then you have 7 seals of history broken, and then you have 7 trumpets blown, and then you have 7 bowls of wrath poured out. And either you have to decide that the apocalypse is going to happen in the most fantastically orderly way possible, or you have to realize that actually maybe the rhythm of this is more about describing the kind of literature we're reading, rather than just describing what the next 1,000 years worth of history have involved or whatever. What I find really interesting, by the way, just let me have an aside. So you have 7 letters, as I said, then 7 seals, then 7 trumpets, then 7 bowls. And if you really hone in on those patterns, when the 7 seals are opened, you'll notice that what happens seems to affect a quarter of the earth. And then when the 7 trumpets are blown, what happens seems to affect a third of the earth. And then there's this little odd note in, I think it's Revelation 14, where John sees 7 thunders, but is told not to write down what happens in the, according to the 7 thunders. And then later on, you then have the 7 bowls, and that affects the whole of the earth. And so there's a question mark in scholarship over, did the 7 thunders, would they have affected half the earth? So you got 7-4, 7-3, 7-2 with the thunders, and then 7-1 with the bowls. It's just a thought, it's just a nice little reflection. But I love the creativity and the cleverness with which these, the text has been developed. Another pattern that you'll notice is that of rhetorical contrast. So John hears things and then sees other things. And there's a contrast drawn between what he hears and what he sees. For example, he is told, so he hears an angel say, "Look, the Lion of Judah." And then when he turns, he sees a lamb. So there's a contrast drawn between what he hears and what he sees that you see spaced throughout the text. There's a contrast between, say, violence and those who perpetrate violence, and martyrdom, which actually is better translated as kind of faithful perseverance rather than just, dying. There's a contrast drawn there. There's a very visceral contrast drawn later on in the text between the whore of Babylon and the bride of Christ. And these are rhetorical devices designed to feel very divisive, very polar opposite, very binary. They're designed to impact us. And we can talk about those a little bit later on as well, if you want. And of course, when we read the text, we want to follow it through. We want to focus on what is the action going on, who has agency in that action, and what is the climax of all that action? What's it building towards? So we do want to pay attention to the actual events. One of the places this is particularly pertinent is the undoing of the 7 seals. And it's easy sometimes, I think, for one of the bad readings that we need to demask from Revelation is to understand the 7 seals as a God pronouncing judgment over future generations. But actually what's happening as the 7 seals are opened is it's building up to the climax of that is Jesus then getting to announce kind of how the story of history is going to end. And so it's not Jesus pronouncing that, it's not Jesus reading it off the scroll, because until the 7th seal has been taken off, Jesus can't read it. So it's what's actually going on is it's almost like the chaos that seems to be going on as the 7 seals are opened isn't really necessarily God's heavenly pronouncement. It's just what seems to be kicking off in life, in the in-between phase between Jesus becoming victor and Jesus getting to announce how the scroll of history is going to end. So we want to pay attention to agency. We want to pay attention to who actually does what. Who gives the 4 horsemen their power? As those 4 seals, the first 4 seals are opened. It doesn't actually say. They were given power. And it's left enigmatically, but I would argue that the ones that give them power are probably more representative of the dragon and the beast than God. We want to notice things like the final battle. What actually takes place at the final battle when Jesus, as the rider on the white horse with eyes blazing, comes out? There's not actually a battle. There's no kind of giant cosmic thing that takes place. The dragon's captured, thrown into the abyss, everything's kind of over. It's this kind of amusing thing of everything gets set up for a Lord of the Rings-esque extravaganza final battle, and pretty much nothing really happens. What's the climax? Where is it heading? Well, thankfully, most of us have an understanding that Revelation 21:22 ends with God's victory. Now, you've got to remember, if you're receiving this as a first century church and you don't know the way the story ends yet, you are building up with anticipation as the chapters are read and read and read. It's a silly little aside, but when I went to see Avengers Endgame, which kind of ended the first few years of kind of all the Marvel movies that had been building up to this point, I was sat in a cinema by myself, and I'd waited about 8 years for this film to come out. And I had all of the understanding, but I had no idea what was going to happen, and the kind of sheer shock and awe as it unfolded. We've had a little bit of a spoiler when it comes to Revelation, but we do want to focus on the fact that how does the story end? The story ends with the victory and the sovereignty of God over any and every challenge to God's authority. And so this whole thing is meant to be good news. This whole thing is meant to be encouraging, not discouraging. So that's our first phase of exegesis. We've looked at the text, we looked at the text on the page, and we started to go, what am I noticing? What are the patterns? Who are the characters? What's going on in the action? How am I feeling? The next stage of exegesis is the co-text, where we read the bit around the text. Now, normally, if you were preaching on a Sunday morning, you had a gospel passage, this is the bit where you might go, right, well, how does this passage fit into the rest of the book? When it comes to Revelation, we're trying with Bible Month to take the whole book together, but you might be preaching or leading worship on an individual theme, an individual week section. And so whilst you want to hone in on particularly what that says, you also want to understand how does that bit that I'm preaching or leading worship on fit within the grand narrative of the whole book. You want to notice where the different images, themes, patterns, characters reappear. Some of those things that you've noticed in your theme, what happens later on. And you do want to read these things together. Again, if we were to give an example of what this looks like in Revelation, it's interesting that the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls all follow similar patterns. And there's a big question in scholarship, and I find this a very compelling, probably I would agree with it, reading, that they are describing the same events from different vantage points, different angles, different places. One is kind of looking at it from the perspective of the persecuted church, or the church who are trying to figure out what it meant to be faithful. Another perspective is from kind of the heavenly throne room, looking down at events. Another perspective is from those who are on the receiving end of the events as they unfold. But actually, it's not 21 different events, if that makes sense. It's the same set of 7 events described 3 different times in 3 different ways. Particularly when you look at the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, the things that they directly affect are the same. It's part of one of the things that you might notice. But if you're just honing in on the 7 trumpets, you might not recognize that. So it is worth us trying to grapple with the text as a whole. I think a particularly helpful way of exploring this kind of co-textual part of the exegesis process with Revelation is to look at the journey of the nations. So we first encounter the nations in Revelation chapter 2, and we're told that they will be under the authority of God's people and the Lamb. That's what's announced to us. And then in chapters 4 to 5, Jesus is portrayed gloriously as, the Lamb upon the throne, the person who has all power and authority over all of creation, which presumably includes the nations. Then in chapters 10 to 11, the nations are prophesied to. John the seer is told to prophesy to them, and there are these 2 kind of enigmatic olive trees that prophesy to them, and we can talk about that language in a bit too. And they react super badly. They don't like being prophesied to. And remember, prophets in the Old Testament, their job was to go to peoples and say, this is what God said. Think about Jonah, another Bible Month book that we've done. Jonah goes and he prophesies to Nineveh. And the purpose of the prophecy is not really actually to announce God's judgment. It's to say, this is the end game of life as you are currently engaging with it. But if you repent, this is how things will end up instead. That's the role of the prophets. So the prophets go to the nations and say, who you are currently siding with, you're currently engaged with the beast, you're currently worshipping the dragon. This is the end game for that. But repent and it will look different for you. Repent and you can be on the right side of the victory over history. But they don't like it. Then in chapter 12, we're reminded that Jesus was born to be the Lord of all nations. Again, just that refrain of, hey, Jesus is going to be in charge here. In chapter 14, we're told the nations have been sent mad by Babylon. Babylon has deceived them, sent them crazy. And actually, the way that they're reacting is because they've been deceived. It's because they've had cosmic powers draw them away from life as it's meant to be. Chapter 15, again, Jesus is declared to be Lord of the nations. I told you it was a book about Jesus. Chapter 16, the nations then collapse along with Babylon. The judgment over Babylon comes and the nations collapse. In chapter 18, we're reminded the nations were led astray by Babylon. It wasn't entirely their own fault. Chapter 19, Jesus again declared ruler of the nations. And then in chapter 20, interestingly, Satan is thrown into the abyss, and it explicitly says it's to stop him from deceiving the nations further. And then we get to the end of the book. In chapter 21, the nations now walk in the light of the New Jerusalem, who we understand is actually God. There is no sun because God is the sun. And then in chapter 22, we're told the leaves of the tree of life that line the river of life in the New Jerusalem, they're there specifically to heal the nations. Now, if we just read chapter 16 in isolation, it would be easy for us to assume that God is against the nations. It would be easy for us to assume that actually it was God's cosmic plan to destroy the nations. But when we read that in the context of the whole book, when we read the co-text around everything else, we suddenly realize that actually God's plan is to redeem. God's plan is to heal. God's plan is to liberate. And actually the journey of the nations is one of salvation, not of judgment primarily. And that's why I think it's really helpful for us to ask, who is the judgment wrought against? And what is the end game? What is the climax of what's going on? So we want to take the book as a whole, and we want to notice these details, like things like the nations, and we want to take a step back and go, okay, I've encountered the nations here in my text. Now I look at the whole of the co-text. What is the journey of the nations? Where elsewhere does that appear? I want to say, remember, if you feel bogged down in a particular passage, if you feel kind of run down in a particular part of the Bible, zoom back out a little bit, go back out to a bird's eye view, look at the whole book, and remind yourself that actually ultimately this is good news, it's salvific, it's encouraging. Okay, so we talked about the text, and we talked about the co-text. So we've done the little bit in the middle, and now we're zooming out to a second phase. And now we want to go to a third phase. Well, we want to talk about the context. This is that kind of classic bit of scholarship, historical critical method, where you ask yourself, what is the world in which the text I'm engaging with? What is the world that it emerged from? What is the culture that it emerged from? And understanding some of this really does help us grapple with some of Revelation's strangeness. So one of the first things that we can say is that the world the text emerged from was the Greco-Roman context. Everything was kind of overrun with this idea of Roman imperialism. Rome was everything. Caesar was everything. And lots of the imagery that we actually find in Revelation pulls up on kind of the imperialistic understanding. So, for example, when we see Jesus on a throne surrounded by 24 elders, all on their own thrones, it might interest you to know that actually when the emperor was traveling around, they used to travel with 12 companions who were kind of like their kind of co-regents, the delegated authority. And then when Domitian became emperor, and this is one of the reasons why people would argue that Revelations was in kind of AD 90, not AD 60, he doubled that amount to 24. So if you're writing to a group of people who know that the emperor travels around different places, maybe, 7 different regions in Asia Minor, and you realize then that they travel around with 24 co-regents, and then you see Jesus described as on a throne, speaking to 7 different regions, 7 different churches, 7 different outposts of his kingdom, surrounded by 24 elders, you might instantly go, oh, this is a claim that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is actually the emperor, that Jesus is Caesar, not Domitian, not Nero, not any of the other imposters. The language of Revelation is steeped in Roman imperialism. It's also helpful to know that unlike our current kind of world setup, where we're fairly keen that we want to keep things like faith and religion separate, that idea just didn't make sense in the first century. Like, religion intersected everything. It intersected commerce, it intersected politics, it intersected everything. It was a very theo-political world. Everything was bound up in religion. You were expected to worship the emperor. If you wanted to be part of a commercial guild, you would often be expected to make sacrifices as part of being part of that commercial guild. You might have to pay homage to Caesar in order to operate in the marketplace. There were different things that you might be expected to do as part of it. And so again, it's a very theo-political world that makes sense of why Revelation seems to make so many political counterclaims. This also draws massively on kind of Roman cultural mythology. So let's talk about the woman and the dragon. This is one of my favorite bits. It's a big old pantomime right in the middle of Revelation, where you have a woman and she gives birth, and then she and the child are chased by a giant dragon, and it's all very exciting. And if it sounds mythological, it's probably because it is. If it sounds kind of exciting, it sounds a bit like Narnia, it's because it is a little bit like that. But what if I told you that there was a standard kind of Greco-Roman piece of mythology in which Python, who is a deity who looked like a great dragon, received a prophecy that he was going to be killed by the son of Zeus. And Zeus at the time was shacked up with a woman called Leto, and she gives birth to a son called Apollo, who then Python pursues. And then they are pursued, and Poseidon, the sea god, hides the woman and the child away. And then when Apollo is 4 days old, he goes back and he kills Python, and the prophecy comes true. And then in Revelation 12, we read about a woman who gives birth, a cosmic-looking woman, by the way, described in big cosmic terms, again, not like normal humans, gives birth to a son. They're pursued by a dragon. They are protected in some way by the sea, and then the child rises up and the dragon is overthrown. You can see how what is being done is they're playing on cultural mythology. I was trying to think of what an interesting comparison might be. If I was to describe Jesus as, I'm not saying this is a good comparison, but if I was going to try and describe Jesus as robbing the rich to give to the poor, that will set off little bells in your head that I'm casting Jesus as Robin Hood. And that's what's going on in certain bits of Revelation that we think are a bit weird, is Jesus is just being cast in the understanding of early kind of cultural images and people, and we're just not familiar with that. We're back to the Theresa May standing in the black knight armor again. So sometimes understanding the Greco-Roman context can really help us grapple with the text of Revelation. Historical and geographical context can also help us out here. And again, it's one of these funny things. I was reading a commentator on Revelation recently who was saying, for many of us who have the privilege of mostly having lived our lives in a Western context, when we read about plagues wiping out a third of the city, or when we read about earthquakes wiping out a third of the city, or we read about warfare wiping out a third of the city, it's very easy for us to go, that's horrific, that's terrible, and gosh, I'm so glad that, this means that the future for us is super chaotic. That might be how we interpret it. But actually, if you're a first century reader who lives in the Mediterranean basin or around Asia Minor, earthquakes, super common, war, super common, plagues, super common. And actually, there wasn't good recovery systems, there wasn't good rescue, there wasn't international aid, there wasn't an NHS. They damaged like a third of the city. And actually, if we just step outside of our own British context for a second, just this year, there have been floods and earthquakes that have killed hundreds of thousands of people. We've just come out of a plague that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. And we are still very acutely aware of a war that's going on that is killing thousands and thousands of people. So actually, rather than us thinking, well, this is cosmic and apocalyptic, maybe we need to think, this just describes a Tuesday. This just describes the world in which we live. I don't think sometimes these things are meant to be understood as fantastical. I think sometimes they're meant to be understood as highly relatable, normal experiences for people. Geographical context can also help us, and you've got a lovely image there on your screen of someone throwing up next to a river. One of the really misunderstood bits of Revelation is the letter to the church in Laodicea, who are told they are neither hot nor cold, but they are lukewarm, and therefore the language is actually, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. And what Jesus says is, I would prefer you to be hot or cold, but I hate the fact that you're lukewarm. And I have heard that interpreted before in my own church context and tradition, that what Jesus is saying is, I'd rather you weren't even a Christian than if you were just a lukewarm Christian. I'd rather you were completely cold than just lukewarm. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, if I'm honest, because I think if we're honest, most of us probably have our lukewarm periods of time where we're struggling a little bit. I think when you look at the disciples, I think probably at various times lukewarm is a fairly accurate way of describing Peter. Don't want to be too harsh to the guy, just saying. I think, so that doesn't make sense in interpretation. But if you understand the historical and geographical context, that Laodicea was in the Lycus Valley, and it was nearby neighbors with Hierapolis and Colossae. And Hierapolis was renowned for its hot water springs, which everyone flooded to, like they used to, in Victorian bath towns and things like that. They go to for therapeutic reasons. Everyone loves a hot spring, right? They love kind of sitting in the Blue Lagoon in Iceland and kind of chilling out in the kind of the natural hot tub of it all. Good for therapy. In Colossae, they were renowned for their cold water springs. And again, you're in the Mediterranean basin. Super hot, super warm. Isn't it nice if you can find a really cold, refreshing spring? The problem with Laodicea is it didn't have access directly to hot or cold springs, so it had to pump the water in via aqueducts. And they actually pumped it down from a hot water spring so that by the time it got to the city, two things had happened. One, it had cooled down, so it was kind of lukewarm, which, is tepid and not very nice. And two, because it was warm, it built up calcium deposits on the aqueduct, which you can see, by the way. You can go and visit this aqueduct. I'm not making this up. This is kind of just archaeology. And calcium then kind of got into the hot water, and it made people throw up. So what Jesus is saying is not, I wish you were not even Christians because you're lukewarm. What he's saying is, you're not very good at being therapeutic. You're not very good at being cold. You're not very good at, you don't really do anything. You're kind of just not very useful. Your faith has become tepid. It's become the thing that people don't come to you for anything. And if they do come and drink from you, they're kind of left feeling a little bit sick, which is a very different way of understanding it. But it's all built around having a geographical understanding of what was going on at the time. If you're the church in Laodicea, there's no chance you miss the message. And it resonates deeply with you because you're like, yeah, actually our water's terrible. What does it look like for our spiritual water to be better? What does it look like for us to be people who might be those who bring therapy to others? Or what might it look like for us to be people who can refresh others? That's on what's going on. So the historical, geographical, cultural context is really enlightening for us as we engage with the text. The other thing that we might want to take note of is the literary context, which, quick word on numbers, basically. The literary world in which Revelation emerged was a little bit obsessed with numerology. They liked square numbers, they liked cubed numbers, they liked to talk about things in pattern numbers. And we're kind of familiar with some of this. We know that there are some numbers in the Bible that are more symbolic than others. So we know that the number 7 is symbolic. You know, you have 7 days of creation, and you have, there's lots of 7s, obviously, in Revelation. And it's this idea of kind of completeness, of wholeness. We know that the number 12 is significant. The number 12, there's 12 tribes and there's 12 disciples. There's a lot of 12s going on in the Bible. We're attuned to that. The number 40 is significant. 40 days in the ark, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days in the desert for Jesus. There are certain numbers that we're attuned to recognizing. And there are a few others that we just might need to learn about. One of those is 1,000. So 10 was kind of it was a large number, essentially. It also kind of represented a completeness, not a holy completeness like 7, but just kind of a totalness, if you like. If you take 10 and you times it by 10, and you times it by 10, so you take a complete number and then you cube it, basically, you get, a vast, vast number. So you may have heard it said that, to say Jesus is holy is one thing. To say he's holy, holy is like saying he's very holy. To say he's holy, holy, holy is like he's entirely, completely holy. So you take the same principle with 10. 10 is a big number. Times it by 10, it's a very big number. Times it by 10 again, it's a completely massive number. And that is how the kind of the language of 1,000 actually is often used in Revelation. It's to be a great multitude. So you have, say, 144,000 people who are heard singing in Revelation chapter 7. And that's a cubed number. That's 12 times 12 times 10 times 10 times 10. It's actually related to the Holy of Holies. It's kind of a cube, which is the shape of the Holy of Holies. But it's also just like a huge multitude made up of 12 times 12, the 12 tribes, each with 12,000 members. So you either have to go, this is super orderly and super neat, or you have to go, there's meaning that sits behind these symbolic numbers, basically. And so when you encounter these numbers, one of the questions you might want to ask is, what did this culturally mean? It's one of the things that you can explore. All of this, by the way, I'm not a genius who's done first-hand research. I'm a geek who's read a bunch of books and listened to podcasts and things like that. Thank the Lord for commentary. As I said earlier, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So if all of this feels a little bit overwhelming, if all of this is like, how on earth am I going to grapple with all of this? Then just remember, a couple of really choice commentaries would be all you need to massively unlock all of this for you. And one of the things that we do every year in the 30-day booklets, we do offer at the back some further reading lists. I've compiled this. There's loads of suggestions of a range of levels of depth and technicality about how to engage with Revelation that will enlighten you in all of this stuff so that you don't have to do tons and tons of research yourself. But it is worth us engaging with these contexts. I know I'm grappling on. I've got 10 more minutes, haven't I? Yeah, great. I'm just double checking. I know we're kind of skipping through, but stick with the program, because I want to just quickly talk as well about intertextuality. So we've done text, we've done co-text, we've done context. Now we're talking about intertextuality, which is where we read the book of Revelation in its canonical context. We read it in light of the other 65 books of the Bible. And Revelation is steeped in the other books of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. So there's a Revelation scholar called Ian Paul who reckons that in the 405 verses of Revelation, there are about 676 allusions to the Old Testament, which is more than one a verse. So if you find yourself reading something and you go, I don't get what these olive trees are about, possibly just go, well, okay, I'm gonna go to Bible Gateway and I'm gonna type olive trees into the search bar and see what comes up, see what it reveals about what imagery might be being referenced. What's the assumption or the understanding the writer's made that they are assuming I have already as I hear or engage with this text? There are loads of references, particularly to Isaiah, which is one of the reasons we're doing Revelation as a follow-up to Isaiah last year. There's loads of allusions to Daniel. There's loads of allusions to Ezekiel. And the question is, how well do you know these books? It might be that you find yourself having to dig into some of these books to help you with Revelation. But this is true of the rest of the Bible as well. We will often find ourselves reading things that we think, oh, what's that an allusion to? And we spent time exploring that last year when we were in Isaiah. What is Isaiah referencing? He spends a lot of time talking about the Exodus, actually. What are the kind of other parts of Scripture that are in play in the bit that I'm reading? This becomes particularly clear, as I say, in Revelation chapter 11. In verses 1 to 2, John is told to go and measure the temple. Measure out the temple. Now, this is an allusion to Ezekiel 40, when Ezekiel is told to do the same, and Zechariah 2, where Zechariah is told to do the same. We've seen people measuring the temple before. And normally what is going on in those passages is Jesus saying, or it's God saying, I'm about to do something dramatic. I'm about to step into time and space and history and do something that regathers my people and that restores them. It's the language of salvation that we get in Revelation 11. In verse 3, we encounter two witnesses, which I think is probably a reference both to, they're described as lampstands, which I think harkens back to Revelation 2, where the churches are described as lampstands. But it's also described as the faithful witnesses of Zechariah chapter 4. And these faithful witnesses are the priests, the new king Joshua and the priest Zerubbabel, who are part of the group that returned from exile to rebuild the Lord's temple. And they they encounter loads of political opposition as they do that. And it makes sense for John to be referencing these people who are faithfully trying to follow God, who are believing that God is stepping into time and space and they're doing something and then they're getting persecuted for it. These priests, these two witnesses, these olive trees, are then in verse 6 of Revelation 11. They're given power to stop it raining and to bring plagues. And you might go, oh, that reminds me, like bringing plagues sounds like Moses. And stopping it raining reminds me of that story of Elijah. And again, you're supposed to recognize these things. They should be making you think, I've definitely seen this before somewhere. I've got a bit of deja vu going on. In verse 7 and verse 11 of Revelation chapter 11, we have the language of death and resurrection. And I do think it's meant to make us think about Jesus. I don't think that is something that we're supposed to miss. These people are crucified, they're laid out on the streets, and yet 3 days later they rise again. And so there's something about these witnesses that represent the church, that represent those that are part of reconstituting God's people, about responding to the way that God is stepping into time and space, who are given the same power and the same authority as the great prophets of the past, are going to go through the same sort of death and resurrection experience as Jesus. And actually that sounds a lot like Paul, when Paul says, I want to know Christ and become like him and attain his resurrection by becoming like him in his death. That just sounds like the idea of take up your cross and follow me. Actually, this is kind of odd language, but when you begin to pull together the different references, it begins to just sound like the gospel we already know. And we're back to that beautiful quote at the beginning from Eugene Peterson about this idea that there's nothing new in this. It's just explained in a kind of much more imaginative way, breathing new life into it. So we've talked about the text, we've talked about the co-text, we've talked about the context, and we talked a little bit about the intertext, reading the book of Revelation in light of the other bits of the Bible. The final stage that we would then do if we're going through the exegetical process is we talk about or think about contextualization. How does this relate to me? How am I going to communicate it to the people in front of me? What does this mean for us today? And we are going to spend more time talking about this in the next section. That's what Jasmine and I are going to have a chat about after the break as we talk about preaching Revelation. But I do just want to quickly recap to round off this session. As we're engaging with the text, we want to be asking, how can we make sure, I suppose, is the question, how can we make sure that what we're preaching actually is a faithful representation of what's going on in Revelation? And I'd argue that it is by going through this exegetical process. So, does it reflect the words on the page? Does actually what I'm preaching reflect the actual words of Revelation, which is the text exercise? Does it resonate with the rest of the book and its message? That's the co-text exercise. Would it make sense? Would my interpretation, would my preaching make sense for a first century audience? If I'm talking about Hibachi helicopters that they have no frame of reference for, I'm probably in the wrong sort of territory. That's the context question. Does it cohere with the rest of Scripture, and particularly the gospel? Does this sound like good news? That's the intertextual piece. If what you're preaching can tick those 4 boxes, you're probably on the right track. You've probably engaged well with the book. And to conclude then everything that I've said, and to kind of like set us up for what we're coming back to after the break, I just want to read this quote by probably my favorite theologian, if I'm biased about it, who's a chap called Michael Gorman, who wrote a really helpful book called Reading Revelation Responsibly. Again, it's one of the ones in a recommended reading. He says this: Revelation is a theopoetic, theopolitical, pastoral, prophetic writing. It is above all a community-forming document. It's intended to shape communities of believers in Jesus as the Lamb of God into more faithful and missional communities of worship and witness. The primary agenda of John the Seer is to increase covenant faithfulness in the Church Universal, both then and now. So I return to the question I started with. Why are we doing Revelation? Why are we looking at this book? And I think it's because as a Methodist church in Britain in the 21st century, we want to be more faithful. We want to be more missional. We want to be communities that worship well. We want to be communities that witness well. Ultimately, we want to be worthy of the title of Little Christ. We want to be worthy of the title of, part of the church. We want to become saints along with those whose footsteps we follow in. And so when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about how do we take the messages of Revelation, some of the key points, some of the themes that we've broken down in the booklet, and explore them in a way that are relevant to us, that help us connect with them, and actually help us respond and live them out so that we become more faithful, more missional, better worshippers, and better witnesses. So I've talked long enough. I'm going to stop there. We've got time for a break. We'll break for about 15 minutes. You've got some time if you want to, obviously, have a cup of tea and all the rest of it, but do text in a question if you got it, and we'll come back to that before lunch. I hope that's been helpful. I hope you feel like you might at least know where to start when you're reading Revelation. Just treat it like another book of the Bible, and I think you'll be absolutely fine. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. I think you would agree with me that that was totally incredible. Oh my gosh, so much stuff to take in. To re-emphasize, we would love to hear your voice through your questions to Michael and our other contributors as we go throughout today. So the number is going to be up on the screen, but just to revise that number, it's 07969 985 376. Please do get in touch, and we will start again after the coffee break at 11:30 in 10 minutes. Thank you ever so much. I hope that you've been able to grab that coffee and have some conversation, perhaps if you are in a group with other people. I'm aware that we are in the spaces of 300 people here this morning and throughout the day, and I think that's just totally incredible. Right across the connection, people are gathering to explore this book of Revelation. That's incredible. Thank you for joining us. We're moving now on to session 2. Now, we're really sorry that we have suffered some technical difficulties and Zoom isn't working. So you will be joining us through YouTube. And we're really, really sorry about that. But the bandwidth just wasn't going to be big enough. We're moving on now to session 2, where we join Jasmine and Michael in a conversation about preaching from Revelation. I hand over to them now.
Smart too. Thank you for being here virtually.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be here. Sorry, I missed being there in person.
Absolutely fine. We're glad that we made this work. So I rounded off the kind of first session by saying that we were going to pick up talking about how do we, having looked at the text, looked at the co-text, looked at the context, looked at the intertext, how then do we do the contextualization piece? How do we start preaching about Revelation? How do we start kind of grounding some of the symbolism and some of the imagery in our own world, in our own context, and impart the message of Revelation to those that we're going to be leading worship for and preaching for through Bible Month? And I mentioned partway through my session as well that we have the advantage that we've had the spoiler. We've seen the end of the movie. We kind of know how Revelation ends. You know, most of us are thankfully familiar and celebrate that image of the kind of new heaven and a new earth, and, you know, God being all in all and all of that kind of fabulous kind of restoration imagery going on there. And so we're going to talk through the different Bible month themes and how people can begin approaching these and begin thinking about preaching in their own context. But we're actually going to do it backwards because we've had the spoiler alert, and actually sometimes it's hard for us to escape how does things end. So we're going to start by kind of talking through theme 4, and then we'll work our way back through theme 1. And we're going to just do this as a bit of a chat. So I'm going to kind of, I don't know, share some thoughts, you're going to share some thoughts. We'll have a bit of a back and forth about the themes, and then we can move on as and when we feel like we're ready. So when it comes to week 4, theme 4 for Bible Month this year, which we've titled Heading Home, the focus of that week is very much this imagery of the new heaven and the new earth. And I think one of the things that strikes me, as I said about the leaders earlier as well, is the imagery is very much a single conceptualization of that, right? It pulls very much on the language of the New Jerusalem. It pulls very much on things that make sense to a first century audience who had their own understanding of what equals, you know, precious metal and what equals, you know, fine jewelry, and even what Jerusalem itself looked like, even what the Holy of Holies looked like. And that's not stuff that we're necessarily immediately familiar with. But we can begin to extrapolate from that different principles, I think, and different ideas, and then kind of rework them into our own modern metaphors. And a few years ago, I was reading a book by a chap called Tom Sine, and he, in that, recounts a image of heaven that has been conjured by a 14-year-old kid living in the Bronx in America, a really poor community, and who was asked to, I think he was called Anthony, and he was asked to describe heaven. And he starts talking about it in terms of, like, you know, there'll be no IRS, there'll be no drugs, that guy, Mr. Mongo, who lives on the street, will be happy for once. And what I found really enlightening about it was just how particular and how personal it was. You know, we don't know who Mr. Mongo is, but we get a particular impression of him by the fact that he'll be happy. And for this kid, restoration, all things being made new, heaven on earth looked like Mr. Mongo being happy, and they're not being like mean animals, just nice ones and stuff like that. And so I wonder, like, as you read Revelation 21 and 22, what are some of the ideas and principles and understandings that you pull out of it that you think would be particularly useful for people to hone in on, to start working new ideas around, metaphors around, and to kind of draw into their preaching? What are some of the things that stand out to you, and how would you encourage people to engage with those concepts?
Yeah, when we hear new heaven, new earth, I think my immediate thought is to recollect some of those sermons that I heard in my lifetime. To talk about heaven and new earth, this is something that we go to after our death. Just I wanted to say that along with so many recent New Testament scholars like Tom Wright and Paula Gutta or Russell Moore, saying that it's new heaven, new earth is something coming to earth rather than we go there, the place after our death. So maybe it's a good starting point to talk about new heaven, new earth in our own cultural terms, because as readers, we carry our own cultural perspectives into the text that we read. So you have explained about the context behind the text, and that is how much it is important, that much important, the context where we come from, that influences the way in which we read the text. So for me, I think the whole picture of firstly, I wanted to say that we are talking about the world where we live in, what that means, experiencing the new reality that Revelation is talking about. And that new reality will be something different for me in my context and my personal experience and the church I go to. It will be different for yourself and the background where you are coming from and your personal perspective on it. So it is very much important how we understand the whole concept of new heaven, new earth. And secondly, the pictures of it, because initially when I look into new heaven, new earth, or the whole the expectation of a new reality, then immediately my reaction is, so what am I expecting here? Am I expecting the kind of, beautiful, massive, the city that it is trying to explain, or am I looking for something different? Maybe that people will have a different opinion about, because the people can easily pick up those massive, the city where we wanted to go, or what we wanted to establish is something slightly different from what I understand from the text. So I think it is explained in terms of massiveness. The new heaven, new earth, or the New Jerusalem in specific, is a massive city with so much of beauty in it, which no human can create. So it's beyond the human imagination or creativity. But in the way that I will try to see is why that image, the New Jerusalem. Why not other images? So for me, I think we have to be very careful with what we pick up from the images that is used in Revelation. So even though it is a massive city and it's a beautiful city, but I think what I liked and I wanted to take the point from that is the power structure is slightly different from what they were familiar with. It's a contrary to, of course, all the images being used from what they are familiar with, but slightly contrary to what they are used to. So it is a borderless city that we are talking about here. So it's not about New Jerusalem as a one place where people go into, but it is a place where God dwells, because Jerusalem is used as an image, because the Jewish Christians at that time, or the audience of John, is very familiar with Jerusalem being the center of their worship. And Jerusalem city as a place they call as a holy city. And because they are already destroyed and they're lost and they're looking for that kind of place, for them, using Jerusalem as an image is more relevant to their context. But recovering something for our context is slightly different from, we can imagine so many things for a new heaven or new reality. Maybe the person coming from Indian context, where I wanted to see is that there is no caste barriers. And that is, I wanted to see the place that you can go anywhere and everywhere without any caste discrimination or, restrictions. So I think each context will have a different picture of how the new reality will look like. And for me, the borderless kind of city that I can imagine by seeing the picture here in this passage.
Yeah, I love I was just going to say, I love that language that, as you said, it's a big city, and I think the size of it is not necessarily about impressiveness, it's about inclusivity. And I love the language of the gates standing open day and night, which is just not what cities did. You shut up your gates at night so that you're safe. But there's no question of being safe there. So the gates can be open. It's the same idea if, Canada's so safe that everyone leaves their door there unlocked kind of thing. It's the same idea, you leave the gates open, and so the nations can flow in and out. And so there's that borderless society idea of the nations coming and going as they please, and this being kind of a very inclusive, huge, because it can fit everybody in its boundaries kind of thing. So there is no borders there. I find that a very compelling part of the imagery going on.
I think the cities and gates, cities with borders or walls is a familiar image that they are, it's not only that Jerusalem was a walled city when, David made it, but also even in the Roman time and all the, the empires that they are familiar with. All the main cities will have a wall around, and there will be gates to go around. So they are familiar with that kind of system. But even though the John is using that familiar image, but slightly different, it's not the a wall to protect from others, but it's a wall where it will be open, it will be safer place, but the gates will be open all the time for anyone to come and anyone to go. But the other aspect I like is, I think maybe for me, I'm not thinking of one place where people come and go. And I am imagining the new Jerusalem going to be the whole world, where God's presence will be, the main focus. And God is everywhere, and that will be the place. And more importantly, it says that there won't be any temple at all. So if there is no temple, God is a temple in that sense, and Jesus is the temple. So so if He is everywhere there is a temple. So anywhere you can worship. So it's the picture, a broader picture. So the initial reaction to Revelation and this particular passage would see that it's a very narrow and exclusive approach to what new heaven, new earth will look like. But I think for me, it's a broader picture, an inclusive picture, and the whole world is a new Jerusalem and it depends on how we view it and how we receive and participate in it.
And I think then that translates then, doesn't it, even into some of our experience of the world today, right? You're talking about a borderless society, you're talking about global citizenship as opposed to, being aligned to any particular one sovereign nation state. And I think, that instantly then means we can start theologically reflecting about things like the Ukraine war and the migration crisis. And, even in the last 24 hours, there's been loads of stuff in the news about what Britain's doing with its borders and what does it, I think Revelation 21:22 then can invite us to think, well, if the new heaven is a place that doesn't have boundaries, that has open gates, that is large enough to incorporate the whole world, what does that mean for how we begin to theologically think about these particular political issues? And again, for me, Revelation is such a political document in that sense.
Yeah, but it is a political document. I think that's one of the reasons that we try to talk about the final chapters before even talk about the previous ones. Because even, as you said in your introduction, the whole Bible can be looked from this kind of angle, from this perspective. That means to reach this realization or the new realities, what needs to be done is the whole history that the people of Israel been, gone through. And the same challenge for us. So if the city is a kind of open city, there is no border at all for anyone to move and go around. I think there are two things. If it is a free and open and borderless society, a borderless world, then people won't even compel to move from one place to another. And if there is a kind of equality and there is no restriction and there is no discrimination, so most of the war against each nation, for example, Ukraine. So we are talking about who holds what and how can we control over one place and how can we expand our territory, and all those issues creates, closing borders and limiting people to move from one place to another. But if there is a borderless society and there won't be any restriction, no one will have a control over anything. So that will free people move from one place to another. Even if they wanted to move, that should not be a restriction. There won't be any restriction at all to move forward. So I think we are imagining a world without border that will help us to reflect in today's world. It's not only what's going across the world in terms of how we fight in the name of our borders and territories and all those things, but also it will challenge us. How do we welcome people, those who are coming from that kind of situation to our country? what is our response theologically to accommodate? So if it is borderless society, at least our country follows, then what is our response to the people, those who are coming to this country?
Absolutely. And that again is that language of, you get in 21 and 22, don't you? The nations flocking in and being healed by the tree of life. So there's how do we contribute to that reality as the church today is a really big question as well. What about then if we turn our attention to scene 3, because we're working backwards. If we turn our attention to this week, which is looking at worship, witness, and waiting. And again, these are ideas that are very central to Revelation. I think mostly the people it was written to were being encouraged to keep worshiping, to keep waiting for something to shift. Like, that was the reality. They are waiting for the new Jerusalem. They are waiting for the new heaven and new earth. They are waiting for that new borderless society. And they're being encouraged to think, what does faithful witness look like? How do we engage with those ideas, worship, witness, waiting? What might it look like for us to grapple with them again in our own kind of modern contextual kind of spaces?
I think for me, in the light of how New Jerusalem would look like, you can imagine people from different languages, race, and culture may just, come and go or can live together for, lifelong. So in that sense, the New Jerusalem is not a place to celebrate monoculture or even a single way of worshiping God. But celebrating differences and freedom to worship our own way. So then there won't be any judgment on which worship is right and which worship is not right, or which theology is right, which theology is not. So there won't be any judgment between, communities. I think it's, it is encouraging. So of course, maybe in John's context, and we have to be very careful that the people at that time might be more worried about how their worship is influenced by the local culture or the colonial culture, and how can be very faithful to their own way of worship and own way of understanding their God. But I think what we could imagine in the New Jerusalem is something. There won't be any domination or discrimination or anything like that. So that means the worship will be more acceptable to each other. No need for that kind of anything that goes against God's will, because it's going to be a peaceful, justice-seeking community or justice-seeking world where you won't see any kind of discrimination against each other based on anything really. Anything to do with worship and all those things. And in terms of waiting, but in that particular context, waiting is something I always struggle with. To whom we are speaking in terms of waiting. For these people are people, those who are persecuted in the name of religion, how long they will wait. So the people, those who are suffering or under oppression, and how long they will wait for liberation. And that question I always have a struggle to tackle with.
Yeah, I was listening recently to a Lent reflection from a chap called Carlton, who's one of the lecturers at the Queen's Foundation, and he was, as a Caribbean man, he was reflecting on how does... Actually, I mean, if Lent is about waiting, if that's part of what the season is about, it's about kind of time in the wilderness and all that kind of thing. He was saying that, for many white people, for many people who haven't lived in a culture where they're oppressed, the idea of waiting, when we're used to having things immediately and having them our way, having them the way that we would choose for them to be, we're very bad at waiting. And he said, when you talk about waiting with cultures that have been subjected to 300 years of oppression or, colonial rule or something, who have faithfully waited generation after generation for liberation, waiting takes on a very different sound, and it takes on a very different cultural understanding. And I was really challenged by that, thinking through, I'm not very good at waiting, actually. And I haven't experienced that generationally. I haven't experienced what it's like to wait centuries for something. And I think possibly there's a lot to be learned from cultures who actually waiting for them has been a long-term game. It's been a multi-generational game. And I think probably that was much more what the writer of Revelation had in mind when he was writing to those 7 churches and the broader Christian community. This might be a multi-generational thing. And so what does it look like to wait well? And I think, I probably need to look outside of my own context for examples of what waiting well looks like, actually.
But also, the waiting doesn't go on its own. It goes along with the worship and witness. Because worship and witness is an important aspect while we wait. So it's not waiting without doing anything. And most of the time that we tend to take that aspect. So we have to wait, we can't do anything with it, and we have to wait for God's time to come. But I don't think Revelation is talking about that kind of waiting. But it's about preparing ourselves or doing something in order to change that situation in terms of liberation or in terms of, oppression to end. Because it's the whole Revelation I see as a journey towards liberation, journey towards a redemption, where at the final end result will be a new reality, that where justice will prevail and only love will prevail, and all those kind of image of a New Jerusalem. So in that sense, waiting is not something that stops you doing nothing, but it's more about preparing yourself. Worship, of course, it depends how you define worship, and participating and witnessing. Witnessing is not something that just you share your testimonies about what God has done for you, but it's more about participating in the world, in its struggle, and bringing that new reality to come soon, than just without doing anything and waiting for it.
And I think bringing some of that into even just our own church experiences then, because I think, as you say, there's a cultural dimension to it, isn't there, in terms of recognizing there's not a monocultural way of doing that. There's not one way of doing that. And even in Revelation, I think there are lots of different examples of what worship and witness looks like. Sometimes it looks like praying, sometimes it looks like singing, sometimes it looks like silence, sometimes it looks like lament, sometimes it looks like prophesying. There's lots of different modes, if you like, of faithful perseverance in witnessing and worship. And I think sometimes one of the things that we can be doing potentially in our churches is just reflecting, what is our flavor? What are we good at? Actually, what do we want to celebrate that we do well? But also to think, hey, what are some of the ways in which our horizons might want to be broadened? What are some of the other things that we might want to press into or learn from or experiment with? Because I think, there's real life and beauty to be found in not becoming fixed in our kind of blinkered, monoed, this is the way we do it around here kind of church cultures, but thinking beyond as well. I think there's a real opportunity for reflecting on that, particularly with this week's theme. Okay, well then, theme 2 is built around the Lamb upon the throne, and that, just Revelation 4 and 5 is just stunning imagery, isn't it? It's very provocative, it's very encouraging, I think. The image of the Lamb on the throne is pretty powerful stuff. A great source of inspiration, actually, for the worshipping and the witnessing that we've just been talking about. But I'm conscious as I read those chapters that, as I said in my first session on reading Revelation, it's language which is it picks up on a lot of imperial imagery. It is the idea of Jesus as emperor. And again, I'm conscious that for some people that's not comfortable imagery, especially if you've been on the wrong side of the emperor, if you've been on the wrong side of colonialism, if you've been on the wrong side of politics and who's in charge. Actually, that could be quite awkward, quite painful, quite off-putting imagery. So I wonder, how do we handle it sensitively? How can we begin to explore what's going on, what the writer's trying to say in a way that is possibly less loaded for people or less offensive for people?
I think current post-colonial interpretations will touch that kind of aspect. But not only post-colonial, but any liberation theology liberation perspective will touch the whole concept of power relations between groups and people. and how do we, deal with the power relations that's there. So, as you said, the whole book is full of colonial images that's been used in order to express all the topics that we are dealing with. It is, that's what I said in the, just before, saying that we have to be very careful when we talk about the images that's been used from the colonial kind of context. But what we miss out is some of the things, it's, even though it may sound like it's a colonial images being used by in way of supporting, but actually at the end it's not supporting, but it's more of a contradictory, or it's more of a challenging to colonial power and the images. So for example, so of course the languages like king and conquering and victory, so all those images, so you have to find a small the opposite characters within it. So that's where it comes. So when he talks about Jesus as who comes from line of Judah, and suddenly you encounter he's the lamb. So you can see that even opposite images within the book itself. Jesus himself been portrayed as a lion, then as a lamb. So, but the lamb is very much important to understand here. So, though it's talking about the king, one who is coming to control and take over, and though it is talking about conquering the whole world, so all those terminologies been used, but suddenly you see something, it's slightly different from what they are used to. It's not the one who is going to control over and oppress anyone, but the lamb, one who is going to be sacrificed for the sake of liberating the whole humanity. So something that's a totally different picture, that we often tend to keep the colonial picture in mind, forgetting about the lamb aspect of Jesus and the alternative approach to how the rule will look like. And sometimes most of, I can imagine some of the countries would take the whole picture of, we have to rebuild the wall and we have to rebuild the whole wealth and all those images. Like we have to make our country as a new earth. You can easily connect with one of the countries. So where you wanted to see the picture, be imitating that colonial picture of Revelation to modern day. So there comes the problem. So, but actually Revelation is not pointing to that kind of picture at all, even though he's using the colonial images, because they are that, just to say that. But what you are expecting, it's not what you are experiencing, but slightly different from, or even opposite to what you are experiencing currently. So to say it is a contrary to what you are experiencing, he has to bring that colonial language, the familiar one, to say that, but it is not.
So he takes the familiar language, but if we foreground the lamb, he's actually undermining it, isn't he? And maybe that then is... That's part of the approach, right, is as we're exploring this in our churches, foregrounding the ways in which, and like you say, it's hard sometimes because it is a slightly more subtle detail, but foregrounding some of those actually really important countercultural ideas, like actually what does true power look like? It looks like a sacrificial Passover lamb. What does true power look like? It actually doesn't look like violent conquest against the nations, but it looks like the healing of the nations. It's that sort of thing, isn't it? What about then, on a similar vein, anytime you talk about imperialism and kind of, there's an undertone, I think, in Revelation of what does it look like to be a citizen of heaven? What does it look like to be someone who is, a follower of the Lamb, someone who has pledged their allegiance to the heavenly King rather than the kind of the beast or the dragon? But we're back to the idea of citizenship, which again, for some people, citizenship is something to be celebrated. And other people, citizenship is quite an oppressive concept. How do we handle that? Or how do you explore the concept of being a citizen of heaven as someone who's gone through kind of having citizenship in multiple places?
We did touch the point about New Jerusalem and New Heaven, New Earth is a kind of new reality where all nations can freely enter and gates can, never shut and it will be open for everyone. Then that means we are the citizens of the whole New Jerusalem rather than in one particular place that is limited and, and not allowed to, there is no restriction to go anywhere with that citizenship. But having in mind, when we talk about the citizenship, immediately I remember my personal experience coming from another country to here. And after so many years, you have to write an exam to become a citizen of this country. And I'm not sure how many of the local community will know the history and all those background of England, but we have to learn in order to write the citizenship exam in this country. So in a way that when we have the whole concept of citizenship, we limit or we narrow down the way in which we include people. So it excludes people for so many reasons. And one of the refugee who came, one of my friend who came as a refugee, and there is no, she can't read and write. She has to go through again and again to write the exam, even though she's been in this country for more than 15 years. Now, because she couldn't pass the exam and she couldn't become a citizen in this country. So, how much, the practical level of, when I talk about the citizenship, but it's more practical level that it restricts. But here, the citizens of heaven or the citizens of New Jerusalem is something totally different from what they understood in John's time in the first century. The citizenship that had something more of, making vow to the king and the emperor and in all those religious aspects that goes along with that. So in that context, now in the New Jerusalem, the citizenship is something, totally the freedom that they have. And there is no restrictions. There is no oppressions. So the new citizenship is something totally different from what they experienced. And that will be a good lesson for us as well today, when we talk about the citizenship in today's context.
I think it's really helpful you saying that in terms of, the story of your friend as someone who has her experience of being told she can't be a citizen because despite living here for X number of years, can't engage with an exam. It's a fight because I think as someone who's been on, again, the right side, if you like, if there is a right side of the citizenship equation, someone who has it simply by being born in a country, I found the idea of citizenship quite a helpful way of thinking about what does it look like for me to learn to be a follower of Jesus. So the idea of entering into kind of a new nationality almost, the language that Paul uses in Philippians of being a political outpost of the kingdom. And the idea of, well, isn't that what discipleship is? Isn't discipleship learning the language and the politics and the ethics and the kind of cultural expectations, if you like, of being part of the new kingdom? So for me, I think that language of becoming a citizen of heaven has been quite a helpful way of conceptualizing discipleship, but actually learning to recognize, well, that might be helpful for me, but it could be a very unhelpful way of describing it for other people. And actually, there is something about citizenship that we do pick up by osmosis, right? When your friend who's, should have citizenship by rights of the fact that actually, they live and they operate here, and it's part of who they are. It's become part of them through the osmosis of just ongoing existence, rather than an exam that qualifies her.
But I think one thing that struck me is when we write for naturalization or the exam to become a citizen, and then we are constructing a homogeneous identity that emphasizes unity to make that citizenship possible. I think the whole question of that itself will make, oppressive power. I think the whole question is whose identity that needs to be constructed, and whose identity we leave out if we make just one, homogeneous identity, and whose identity we are losing. So we have to lose some of the things in order to take up the citizenship here. So who constructs it, and who has to leave their identity in order to take up another identity? So the whole question of identity comes when we talk about citizenship. So whether you make a homogeneous or even individual identity, both have a problem in itself that can be more oppressive in itself. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about citizenship. That's what I meant.
And that potentially is one of the reasons why actually Revelation helpfully, it talks about those who Jesus puts his seal on their foreheads and who writes their names, because it's Jesus then who's the one who's kind of gets to make the, it's actually Jesus who enacts that. It's Jesus who does that on our behalf almost, rather than anything that is required of us to. So that there's potentially more helpful imagery, I think, within Revelation itself that we can hone in on that might bypass some of those unhelpful ideas.
But that is true. It's not the human, king that we are under and we are obedient to, but it's God one who is in control. So in his name, we do all the things. So everyone will be citizens of one category. That will be just God one who is love. And that's a relationship that makes citizenship more important and unique than any of the citizenship that we encounter in the world.
Yeah, great. Okay, and that brings us to theme 1, our first week, which is talking about the church then and now. And one of the things I've discussed already is the fact that I suppose Revelation as a document, as a letter, is written to these 7 churches as a primary audience, but although everyone else, I think, can receive it as a secondary audience. And one of the things I'm struck by when you read the letters or the kind of almost royal proclamations, which is probably a better way of understanding what they are, to the different churches, is they all receive their own thing. So even though they're all wrestling with the same kind of ideas and they're all wrestling with the same sorts of, what does it look like for us to be faithful and to persevere and to witness well in our context? Some of them are praised, some of them are critiqued, but they all receive an individualized, personalized to their message. So Laodicea is very personal to them. It's very personal to their actual experience of, their own water system. And I think that probably gives voice for us to then think through, okay, well, what would the royal proclamation coming to us be? What would the royal proclamation to our own church or circuit, or even, British Methodism, or even us as individuals, what might that look like? What might Jesus say? And how might that be loaded with stuff that was personalized to us? So it's not unique to us necessarily. The message isn't unique to us, but it's been personalized to us. And so I don't know what are some of most of what Jesus is writing about is about perseverance and not compromising. So what do you think perseverance and not compromising might look like for us today? Because it probably doesn't look like pledging allegiance to Caesar. But how can we engage with that?
I think that's the reason we touched how the new reality will look like. So where there won't be any discrimination or exclusion or, restrictions. So all those categories, when you think about the churches, then you have to think about the reality of new heaven, new earth. So from that picture, so what we see here is, so preaching is always very contextual. Mm-hmm. And we prepare a sermon for your own particular audience or congregation that you are going to preach. So in that sense, what John is writing to the people at that century and that time, so you can take that one as a preaching. So John is preaching to the people what the churches in Asia Minor to do for their own particular context. That means taking that message for us to achieve this new reality, new heaven, new earth. And what is our response? What is missing in our churches? So always John talks about, you are good at this, but you are missing this. So what is the missing aspect in our churches that each individual church may differ? So in your own individual church, what is the missing aspect that is not allowing you to experience a new reality of the new heaven, new earth? And if that is the case, what will be your focus to expand, to understand better, and what God wants from that particular congregation? So So I would say that, some churches may already grapple with. So this is what we understand the new heaven, new earth. So we can press on and do more and more, and influence others to, challenge others to move forward to the same direction. But some churches might be still behind understanding what it is. So they might be tackling to understand the new reality. So each individual preacher needs to have a more understanding of their congregation in order to give that message, what exactly they wanted to convey.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and actually quite an exciting thing, hopefully, to engage with is, imagining prophetically, if Jesus was writing to us, what would he commend us for? What would be the kind of, the well done, pat on the back elements, and what would be the, but this I hold against you element, which, I think we can read that language in Revelation as quite heavy-handed, but I think ultimately it's saying this is an area for you to grow in and to work on. And I think that's true for all of us. And so yeah, helpful for us for the fact that comes in week 1, I think is quite handy, because it begins to posture us to some of how we might engage with the rest of Revelation as well, So,
yeah.
Brilliant.
I think, for example, if the context where I come from, the Indian context where caste system still exists within the church, some of the churches still, they don't accept women priests. So all those kind of, very, very general kind of that applies to most of the Indian churches, then I would challenge in terms of, to make that new heaven, new earth reality in that particular church. And that needs to be dealt with. So because they are excluding based on caste, gender, and so on. So those things need to be dealt with in order to even realize or experience the new reality. So each individual can bring that challenges in their own context to make that reality happen.
That's a really helpful example. Thanks, Jasmine. And thank you for your input over the last 40 minutes. I think we're about to transition into a time of Q&A, but I don't know if you've got any final thoughts you want to throw out for those preaching and worship leading their way through Revelation. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, even just a word of encouragement.
I think the new heaven, new earth, the reality is a beautiful one. So once you know what it is, and if you want to kind of experience and realize that reality, and that will be more happiness that you can do than what we are at the moment. So it's just to get that happy moment. I think we will work towards that kind of reality. We all will be partakers in that. So I would encourage people to just tackle with all those kind of issues.
Fantastic.
Thinking about the happiness at the end, work towards that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that we've been able to get you connected in with the day. Enjoy the snow in Manchester, and we'll connect again soon.
Thank you, Michael.
Bless you.
Thank you to Jasmine and Michael for taking us through those themes. As a local preacher myself, I found that some of those nuggets that they were giving us so helpful to the way that I'm going to start to unpick those scriptures, to be able to understand them, to then be able to communicate them. Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? That many of us face week in, week out. So thank you to Jasmine and to Michael, especially Jasmine, overcoming all of those technical things that needed to happen for her to engage and bring all of those wise words to us today. Now is the time that we are joined by Michael. Michael, we're going to be asking you some of the questions that have been zipped in to us. People have been engaging. People have been asking lots of questions. One thing that is a common theme is how can we access some of this stuff after the event today? How, as a local preacher, am I going to be able to rewind today and be able to get more insight?
Excellent question. Thankfully, quite an easy answer. So the recording of the full day will be available on the Bible Month YouTube channel. So just youtube.com/Bible Month. So you can catch up with that. At some point early next week, I'll cut it all into chapters so that you can watch the individual sessions rather than having to flick through to find them. And in terms of slides, yeah, absolutely, we can make those available. We'll probably make them available to download from the main Bible Month page on the Methodist Church website. So again, methodist.org.uk/Bible Month. Scroll down and there's a list of resources there. There's lots of great resources, actually, I have to say, not just the slides. There's a reading guide, there's a journaling kit, there's going to be some stuff that Lawrence is talking about later on as well.
Brilliant.
So, yeah.
Brilliant. That's so excellent. And you've included so many things that people have been asking.
Okay.
One just point of technicality, Michael. Right at the beginning of when you were talking,
Yeah.
you used a quote from Brian McLaren, I believe, but people are asking whether that's Brian McLaren or Eugene Peterson.
Yeah, the slide was correct. I was wrong. Yeah, it was a Eugene Peterson quote. It's from his book Reverse Thunder,
Awesome.
which is a really excellent, it's a really excellent kind of little helpful commentary.
Yeah.
Quite accessible. But the funny thing was when I then referenced it back later, my brain went, you said Brian McLaren earlier, and I just had to zip on. But it was Eugene Peterson. Sorry about that.
We all do those things, don't we?
Yeah.
We all do those things. So I'd just like to pick up on some of the themes that people have been trying to grapple with, myself included. Sat here today, there's some things that are coming up, bubbling up, that people want just to know a little bit more about, if that's okay. So if we can tease out those things. One of those main things that people have been texting in, and I'm going to sort of lump all of their questions together, is about the place of females, of women in Revelation. Now, you've alluded to that there is pictures of women in the imagery that aren't so positive. So how is that to be accessed?
I think, again, this is probably another place where Revelation's like other biblical books, that we need to try and begin to appreciate some of it on its own terms, which it doesn't exclude the fact that it makes us uncomfortable. It's not wrong that it makes us uncomfortable. It's not a bad thing that we notice that and want to do something about it. So Revelation particularly, there aren't many women in it to start with. No. One of them is just she gives birth to a child and then is moved on, and that seems to be kind of very patriarchal kind of perception of a woman. The other big one being the whore of Babylon, contrasted with the bride of Christ. I think I've found the work of a particular feminist theologian called Elizabeth Fiorenza really helpful in terms of this, where she, as I've just said, talks about how it's okay that you notice it, it's okay that it's uncomfortable, but let's recognize what is rhetorically going on and culturally going on. Rhetorically, what's going on is it is being drawn as a very stark contrast. But also culturally, what's going on is it was fairly normal to describe cities as women, in the same way that we talk about ships as female. There are certain kind of things that we anthropomorphize, that we gender when they don't have a gender. And cities were always women. So, it makes sense to call Jerusalem a bride and Babylon a whore if you're trying to say a good city and a bad city. The kind of city that you want to be a part of, to wed yourself to, and the kind of city that you don't. It's not that the language is appropriate in a modern context, but we do need to appreciate we're handling an ancient document. So I think it's worth us acknowledging that it hasn't been used very well in the past and that language can be used horrifically, but also to recognize that the writer wasn't making a statement about the status of women. They were making a statement about cosmic powers and why you would want to be faithful to Jesus. And so let's try and hone in on the rhetorical purpose rather than just getting lost in the awkwardness of the language, even though we should acknowledge the pain that it can cause.
Yeah, and from the way I've heard you speak, Jasmine speak today, that's so common about lots of the themes, isn't it? It's about that imagery and trying to unpick that imagery.
Yeah, because there's lots of language in that could be offensive to different groups. But I don't think that's what the writer's trying to do. No. I don't think the writer is making a statement about ethnicity, or if they are, actually they're making a positive statement. I don't think the writer is making a statement about femininity, although if they are, I think actually they're pushing into, I think they would want to push into positive language, but that's not what they're doing. So it's, what is the image actually trying to depict and say, not just focusing on the surface reflection. Although, as I say, I still want to be someone who acknowledges the fact that Revelation has a history of being wielded in a really painful and oppressive manner. And so we want to acknowledge that but also steer people into the truth that it does have to offer, whilst discrediting the bad readings. It's unmasking the Scooby-Doo villain again.
Yeah, so part of that imagery thing, there's a lot of numbers.
Yes.
Now, numbers, oh boy, as a local preacher, I don't even dare to go there because I don't understand it. I don't feel confident in understanding it to be able to communicate to others. Can you just unpick a little bit more the significance of the number 7? Because 7, you said this morning, 7, 7, 7. So what is it? What's going on there?
So the significance of the number 7 finds its birth, if you like, in the creation account. In 7 days, God created the fullness of everything that exists. And so it kind of had this cultural understanding, particularly for the Jewish people and for the early church, a particular cultural understanding of this is a number of completeness, it's a number of wholeness, it's the number of how things are meant to be. So when you encounter the number 7, when 7 seals are opened, there's a complete unveiling going on. When 7 trumpets are blown, there's a complete proclamation taking place. When 7 bowls are poured out, there's a complete judgment which is being enacted. So that's how the language of 7 is being used very carefully. And as I say, that's true for lots of parts of the Bible. Often if you encounter number 7, you should ask the question, is this significant? Answer almost invariably, yes.
Excellent, excellent. I will watch that bit back so I understand it a bit more. I think it's just that thought of numbers. I'm more a words person.
I'm massively put off by numbers too. It's absolutely fine. Yeah, they scare me.
I think that sort of final point that's been coming through in the questions is that place that Jesus plays in the book of Revelation. And when you first look at the book of Revelation, it's hard to kind of decipher that role. What is this meaning for us today? So some questions on that, really. So would you compare martyrdom in Revelation to take up your cross in the Gospels that Jesus spoke?
Yeah, the translation of martyrdom in Revelation isn't necessarily hugely helpful. It's better understood as the language of witnessing. It's better understood as the language of faithful perseverance. So it's not just about death, basically. It's not just allowing yourself to be trampled upon. It is about what does faithfulness look like? And the reason I relate it to the imagery of take up your cross is Jesus, I think, is fairly honest with his disciples that walking in his footsteps won't always be easy. And I think Paul is fairly similar when he talks to the churches. He says, actually, if everything feels hunky-dory to you, this is obviously a paraphrase, if everything feels hunky-dory, maybe something's not right. So when Paul is asked to give account of his apostleship, when the Corinthians are like, we're a bit embarrassed by you, Paul, because you're not very eloquent and you're not very good, and actually, you won't let us pay you. What makes you worth your soul? And Paul goes, well, if I was super eloquent and if I was like well paid and all the rest of it, am I really stepping into the fullness of discipleship that Jesus called me to? I'm actually going to boast in all of my sufferings. I'm actually going to kind of talk about the fact that what gives me a right to speak to you as an apostle is the fact that in following Jesus, I've been shipwrecked and I've been flogged and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that we should therefore pursue being shipwrecked and flogged. What I am saying is that I think there's something about, and this is what Revelation really is all about, we are in a culture war for our hearts and minds. And there are false messiahs out there, the beast from the sea, and there are false Jesuses out there, the dragon, and there are false Holy Spirits out there are false religious institutions out there that would vie for our allegiance, our time, our money, our effort, our ethics, all of that kind of stuff. And if you are going to side against them, you might find yourself getting caught up in the chaos of it all, and it might lead to things being a bit tricky. And what Revelation is saying is stay faithful, because actually Jesus wins out, and actually you're on the right side of history, and actually you are where you're meant to be. But don't be surprised if. And I think it's particularly poignant that the 2 churches that don't get a criticism, of the 7 letters, 5 churches get a thumbs up for this, thumbs down for that. The only churches that get just a pat on the back are those that are being persecuted. And Jesus is like, I'm right in here with you. And I think where is Jesus in the text? He's right at the beginning, stood solid as the Lord of the universe, literally juggling the universe in one hand. He's holding 7 stars in his right hand, and that's a imagery again stolen from Greco-Roman culture of the goddess Hecate, who holds 7 stars, which was the known 7 planets at the time. So Jesus only needs one hand to juggle the universe, and with the other hand reaches out and touches John, and then writes to the 7 churches and says, those of you who are persecuted, I'm with you. And actually, those of you who aren't persecuted, it's normally because you're compromising. Yeah. It's normally because actually you're betraying some of your values, and I'm just calling you back to repentance. It's tricky for us because we're in a modern context where we're not quite caught up in the same culture war. You know, we don't live in a context where it's either you pledge your allegiance to Jesus or King Charles. That's not the dynamic we're caught up in quite the same way. But there are still things out there that would deceive us, that would vie for our attention, that would cause us to compromise, that would pull us away from faithfulness. And I think what Revelation says is keep looking at Jesus. And he crops up constantly. He's there at the beginning, he's there at the end, he's there throughout. And I think that is because John constantly wants to draw our attention back to the fact that it is the revelation of Jesus Christ.
And so nicely landing after that, like within me, I just so want to ask you about dragons, but I can't. The final question really is that landing place of, is Revelations telling us there will be a second coming of Jesus?
The short answer is yes. I think, and again, you can't get away from the theological context of the book. I think Paul basically says in 1 Corinthians 15, if there's no resurrection, what are we all doing here? Again, that's my paraphrase. But he basically says, if there's no resurrection on the last days, then we may as well eat, drink, and be merry, because what's the point in life? And I think Revelation very much has this view of, at some point there will be a final judgment and a final resurrection, at which point God will be all in all. We have to contend with the fact that we're receiving this document 2,000 years later. How do we engage with that? How do we interpret it? How do we understand it? Do we want to say it's nice symbolism? Do we want to say it's nice metaphor? And scholarship is divided, and the church is like different church traditions do different things with it. You can't escape the fact that I think, is there going to be a second coming? I think that's what Revelation believes. I think that's what John the Seer believes. What does that mean, or what does that look like, or how to interpret that? That's the question which is open to us as readers today.
And I think that's why we've got all of those. You started this morning by saying about like almost those false readings, the different readings of Revelation. And I think that's why we've got so many of those, isn't it? Because the guessing game continues, really.
It does continue, and I think there are more or less helpful readings. I'd say those that rely on something like a rapture are a less helpful reading, I think. But the church has engaged actually through the last 2,000 years with how do we understand the second coming? How do we understand this idea that Christ will return and that, and will set all of history right? And I think as Jasmine's just finished, actually, there's something about, if we fix our eyes on the promise of what that future might look like, that can be one of the most helpful. We don't have to understand how and when it's going to happen. And I think even Jesus says, even I don't know, sorry. We don't have to determine all of that. We don't have to get stuck in, it's going to be September the 5th, 2032. What we need to give ourselves to is, this is what God says the end game of all of human existence is. This is what it looks like for life to be as God intended it. It's a return to Eden, the Eden place, right? And we can participate in building towards that. Whether or not we conclude that there will or won't be a second coming and a resurrection, I think the imagery of 21-22, keeping that fixed in our minds of how do I participate in that becoming a reality in partnership with God, that's a good place for us to be without getting bogged down in the rest of it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for everything you've given us this morning, Michael. I know you're sticking around. You're going to be here to answer some more questions later and to round us up a bit at the end of the day. Thank you to you all for engaging this morning. This afternoon, we will take that imagery a bit further with the wonderful Gail Adcock, bringing to us how it is that we can use this text of Revelation in an all-age capacity. How can we use that imagery, symbols, to engage everybody in the congregation into conversation about the message? And then we'll have Lawrence Waring talking about the symbols through songs and hymns and how that's been throughout the years and ages, and how that we can, as preachers, use it going forward. So please do come back at 1:15. We will kick off with session 3. So at 1:15, we will be back here live with you. And thank you, and do have a great lunchtime. Thank you. Welcome back from lunch. I hope it was a good one for you. It certainly was a good one here. We have a whole afternoon planned for you and for us to engage with as we continue that journey through Revelation and how we use it in our preaching and leading contexts. So we're really, really pleased that we have Gail Adcock with us from the Children, Youth and Families team from the Methodist Church. And she would love some questions from you. So do continue to put through your questions to the number that we gave you earlier. I see it's now on the screen. So please do send us your questions and we'll put them to Gail a bit later on. So over to Gail for all that you have to bring for us.
Thanks, Bridget. Folks, it's really good to be with you today, and welcome to our session exploring how to make great use of the all-age resource that is in Bible Month. And I'm going to share some thoughts as well on good practice, because that seems helpful, because we're thinking about how we bring people of different ages together, as well as using some of the activities that are in the booklet as well. So hopefully a really good mix of learning about how we do this stuff well, but also looking at the content that you can find in the booklet. In this session, I'm going to focus on the resource that's in week 4. So if you have your booklet to hand, you may want to turn to page 21, so you've got it in front of you so you can take a look as I refer to it throughout. And it's also important to mention that the activities that have been offered there work really well indoors, but also equally well outdoors. So if your church or your community space has access to some outside, some green space, do make really good use of it. Either take a service or a session outside, or of course just to go and do an activity as part of whatever it is that you're doing. It's just a really great way of using the different space at our disposal. During this session, there are a couple of things that it would be useful for you to have to hand. So a pen and some paper would be useful, maybe some felt tips if they're handy. Don't worry if you haven't got them there. And also a glass of water. So I'm going to give you a moment or two just to get those things and then to come back down as we embark on our learning this afternoon. We're going to have those things to hand. The Bible Month resource gives you a wealth of different material to use with different groups in different settings. It's designed to be really flexible and adaptable. So you can use it with different groups of people of different ages, different congregations. And I'm going to focus, though, on the activities you can do with people of all ages. Now, I'm wondering, it might be tempting for some of us to switch off at this point, because in a number of places where we lead and we preach, there may not be any children and young people, and we hear this now and again. But let me encourage you to keep on paying attention. by saying all ages, I'd like us to avoid assuming that that always means children and young people, because we often find that our churches and our groups are intergenerational groups because there are simply different generations present in the room. So you may say that in the churches you go into that there aren't any, but if we're thinking intergenerationally, then there may be those people from different generations. So bear them in mind. And you might just want to bring one or two people into your mind as we're thinking about this afternoon. The all-age resource that is offered in Bible Month is, of course, ideal to use with children and young people. But it also offers us another way to explore Scripture, and that's part of the beauty of what's offered there, so that we can use our senses and our imaginations to engage in ways that help us arrive at new understandings, to perhaps notice new things or encounter God in new ways. So they work with people of all ages. So even if you may not feel that there are opportunities to use the entire resource as it stands, I'd encourage you to dip into it. Perhaps dip into the activities, whether that's in a service or in a small group, because it really helps people to engage with the text in creative ways. Now, when we sat down, I will make a confession now. When we first sat down to start to think about what might the all-age resource look like for Revelation, we were more than a little daunted. But as we began to dive in, as we began to read passages and chapters, as we got to grips with the narrative, it just became clear that actually there was lots to get really excited about. And there are a number of reasons why that was the case. First of all, because it's such a visual book of the Bible. There are plenty of incredible images. We've got dragons, we've got a lamb, we've got God's throne, we've got this golden lampstands. All of these things are really great visually, which is really helpful when we're working with people of different ages. And secondly, there's this really powerful narrative in John's vision, what he offers to us in those chapters. And we get a chance to kind of be captivated by the creativity of everything that's offered there, the images that it conjures up for us in our mind's eye. And then finally, there are all of the interactive possibilities. And so as we were starting to read it, as we were starting to kind of throw around different ideas, we just got really excited because we thought there are lots of ways in which we can interact with this. And it might even mean that we see Revelation and understand it in some really different, unique, new ways. Now we're going to begin with the text. So I'm looking at Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 to 3. And I'm hoping it's going to appear for you in a moment on the screen so that you're able to follow along. And it says this: "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life." Let me just make sure that I'm in the right place. Here we go, yes. "Bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the streets of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him." So if you've got your pen and paper to hand, there's a question for you to ponder for the next moment or two. What images or sounds do you think of when you hear the words, "the river of the water of life"? What an incredible phrase. What images and sounds do you think of when you hear the words, "the river of the water of life"? So on your paper, jot down what comes to mind. Draw a picture. If you'd rather, you can doodle, but just have a moment of reflection on those words. Now, if we were in church together, I'd probably have those verses printed out in a really great large font on sheets of paper and available for everyone. Maybe one in a small group or one between two, or I might put it out up on the screen as well for people to see, making sure that it's possible to read it easily. And I'd probably also include a photo. And I had created this little slide which could go through with this little moment of reflection, which has a picture of the River His. So where I live, up in North Hertfordshire, this is a local river to us. And I think it's always a really good idea to try to build those connections with people's everyday life and experiences. So when we're all ages together, if we can refer and make those connections with people, it really helps us as we engage and as we try to grow in our learning and understanding. So by putting this image up, I'm immediately saying to people, here's something that you know that's familiar to you, connect that with what you're reading in God's word, and that helps our imaginations come to life. So I wonder what you jotted down, what your images would look like. And if we were in church, in a congregation, we might want to turn and show each other. If we were in a small group, again, we might invite people to share some of what they've drawn and written. And of course, if you want to, you might want to take a photograph and send that through to us if you wish. Now, let me share a little bit with you about some good practice in terms of being all ages together in the same space. And there are some things about good practice which actually I think might be really useful for us as we're trying to apply this kind of material. And all of this is really grounded in participation. And participation welcomes the contribution and involvement of everyone, regardless of our age, of our ability. All of us are able to find a way to contribute. And there are 5 top tips which I'm going to give you, which I hope will be useful as you're working with people of different ages. And when we bring people together, one of the key aspects are actually how we look for opportunities for conversation. Conversation is really key. We're always looking for ways in which people can grow in relationship with each other. And what has become apparent over the last few decades is in church life, we often separate people for very good reasons, usually. But the outcome of that is that perhaps we don't know each other quite so well, and we've become at times a little bit wary when we're in each other's presence, and we perhaps don't quite know what to say to each other. When I grew up in the Methodist Church, one of the things I loved was that the steward, Ron, knew me by name. So if I legged down the corridor, he would know who I was and be able to call me and say, Gail, just slow down there, don't run so fast. So let's try to think a bit about where those opportunities might be for us to speak with one another, to just have some simple conversations, because that helps us feel at ease and it helps us to enjoy the diversity that exists in being people of different ages in the same space. Now, secondly, let's think about the importance of the fact that being all ages together really nurtures discipleship. And so when we have those conversations, we are learning about faith from each other. Questions can often be really great ways to open up the conversations and the discussions. We get to know a little bit about other people's faith. We get to share stories of our own experience, what it's meant to be a follower of Jesus. And as we hear those things, as we share them, we build each other up in faith. And that can really make sure that, particularly for our children and young people, their faith is really firmly rooted. And we know from research that if that happens during those early years of our lives, faith stands a chance of really being firmly established into adulthood and later life. So the things that we do as a church when children and young people are with us makes a real difference in those years to come and the years that follow afterwards. And then thirdly, there's something when we are all ages together about the importance of using our senses. And there are ways in which, when we're in church, that we often do lots of listening. So it's often a very auditory experience. But it can be useful if we think about ways to employ our other senses. So when can we look? When can we taste? When can we touch things? When can we smell things? If we make use of those, it means that we often remain much more alert to what we're hearing. It means that we're applying and we're thinking, we're making connections in our mind, and it helps generally for just our curiosity to be really sparked and brought to life. And it just means that we're much more likely to remember and to take away and think beyond the here and now. Fourthly, and this might be a little bit daunting for some folk, but be ready for the unexpected. Because when we're all ages together, it's often the way that random questions will just appear. Someone may just put a hand up and want to know something more. And things may happen which we're not anticipating. And I'd urge us not to be afraid of that. And I know sometimes we might suddenly get a little bit of fear because we're not quite sure what to do in those moments. But my suggestion is just respond. If that question appears, if a child dashes to the front, has something to say, engage with them, talk to them. It's all part of us being family and the body of Christ. So people can be engaging in different ways. They can be perhaps moving around. They might not be sitting still. But even if they are, they're still taking in what is being shared. We don't just have to be sitting still, looking at the front, to be understanding and learning. So if there's a little bit of movement, if people are moving around, let's just make space for that to happen and become comfortable with it, and to just be willing to engage with the group, whoever we're with, so that they can learn. And then finally, the fifth bit of good practice is really around keeping the pace up. Because actually, there's a danger sometimes that in the middle of a session, in the middle of some activities or a service, the pace may drop off a little bit, it slows down. And we just need to make sure that at that point, we either do something different if we sense people's attention is drifting, we do a different activity, we get people stood up, we do something that's physical and active, because that will help people to get back focused into what is happening. So keep the activities moving. If an activity looks like it might last, 10, 15 minutes, if after 8 minutes it's finished, people seem to have completed it, be ready to just go on to the next thing. In my experience, no one has ever complained if something has finished early. So I'd always say, keep the pace going, and don't worry if it means that your plan has to adapt and change in light of that. So let's take a look now at the booklet. I hope you've got yours to hand. And on page 21, you will see 4 activity ideas. And these ideas are different levels of effort, different levels of ways to participate, and things to think about. And they've been written to be open-ended. There isn't a particular kind of thing that needs to be accomplished or achieved by the end of the activity. Each of them draws a connection with the passage, so there's a way in which we can build our learning and our understanding through whatever it is that we're doing, and bring it back to what we've been reading about. And so the 4 activities are, there's one that talks about river reflections, which talks about collecting images of rivers. The second one is about going for a walk in the water, and there's a suggestion that you could go to a local river and maybe have a paddle if that's possible for you. Or if you're feeling super brave, and some people might struggle to see how you can make this work in your setting. But if there is a way in which you can construct a river, if you've got a tough tray, if you've got some tarpaulin, be creative and try to create something where there is some water that perhaps people can come and put their hands or feet into. And then there's an idea about making fruit kebabs, so all kinds of different fruit. If you've got people who like to grow things in their allotments, or you've got local markets, grab stuff that's local to you to use. And then finally, there's an activity about planting some seeds. And you can do that in all kinds of different ways. It's particularly good for young children, that activity, and the adults who are with the children can help them to do that. And you can bring in everything that's kind of needed, and then maybe set it up as an activity that people can engage with at whatever point works well for them. I'm going to give you a moment now. Now, if you're in a group, you can talk about this with one another. If you're by yourself, you can have a time just quietly reflecting where you are, and maybe think about the different churches or different groups that you work with. and have a think about which one of those activities you think you could build into an act of worship. Now, it might be that you'll do this by a process of elimination because you'll think there's no way I'm doing that one. But you might actually think, hang on a minute, how could I make that possible where I am? So be courageous, be bold, choose something that maybe feels a little bit risky for you. Now is the chance to explore it, and have a think about how could you make that work in an act of worship in a church or a setting that you are regularly a part of. So you are going to have, let's double check the time, you're going to have about 8, where that some of you may have not had the material in front of you to be able to actually look at. So we can show you that briefly now. When you get a copy, you can go and look at page 21. That's what you can see now. That's where you'll find the week 4 all-age resource, and take a further look at those 4 ideas and see whether or not you can actually put one of those into practice as part of your work and ministry. So we're going to move on to thinking a little bit about troubleshooting. When we work with all ages, it can sometimes feel some of the fear of not quite knowing maybe what will happen can be a bit daunting. And so it's just worth saying a few things about how to handle and manage any possible issues that arise. So when things don't quite go to plan, there's always this question about, should I stick to the plan or ditch the plan and go and do something else? And I would always say, just have the confidence to feel that you don't have to stick 100% to what's on paper. So if people's attention is drifting, if you're noticing that perhaps there's a phrase that perhaps we use sometimes, which is about if you feel that you're losing the room, if people aren't paying attention, that you may just want to think about, actually, let's stop what we're doing here and let's just move into doing something else. If people are drifting away, we have to learn to be flexible and adapt. So do something else. Like I was saying earlier, maybe find something active or physical that we can do, which brings everybody's attention back together again. Secondly, I'd always recommend that you have an idea up your sleeve. Now, this goes back to my primary school teaching days, which was always that it was important to have something to do in that moment when perhaps everything had just gone a little bit pear-shaped, or just something had happened and things had gone in a slightly different direction. So, in terms of finding something that you can keep up your sleeve, maybe a couple of open questions. They would work really well, because you can just say, turn to the person next to you, have a conversation about this, and then you can take a bit of feedback from the room and ask people to share their thoughts. Or you can do a really simple activity or a game. So find something that you can always just keep up your sleeve for those moments when the unexpected happens and you're just ready with something that you can do in that moment. And then thirdly, I am always recommending that people have what I would describe as an all-age kit. So if you're regularly going into churches and you're perhaps unfamiliar sometimes with who's there, with the people that you might meet, or whether you're even unsure if children and young people will be present, then just keep a few items in a bag or in a crate that you have with you that you can just bring out in case you need them. It's a type of thing that we can just kind of have ready to go, that is always just packed and ready that we can pick up. So, and the kind of things that it's useful to have in there are some, like a pack of A4 paper, maybe some felt tip pens or a roll of paper. Lining wallpaper is brilliant for this because you can roll it out and do all kinds of things with it. Maybe a few pots of Play-Doh and a mat to use it on. Some Post-it notes, another really great resource to have handy, and some Lego or some bricks or a construction toy of some kind. Because at short notice, they are easy things to get out, and there will always be a way in which you can use those things. So, for instance, the question that I asked earlier on about the river of life, you could roll out the paper, very quickly draw a river, or ask some people who are there to draw a river, and then they can fill in and write their own words or draw pictures on that roll of paper. So it just means you've got a few things to hand that you're able to use at very short notice. And then finally, and I think this is sometimes perhaps a little bit tricky, it's the thing about right answers, right or wrong answers. Is there such a thing? Because it can be tempting sometimes for us to ask questions that have seemingly only one response. Now, I don't know about anybody else. If I am sat in a space with an awful lot of other people and I think that there's only one right answer to this, I will be very reluctant to speak up and say anything. If you ask me a question which has a million possibilities, then I'll be much more at ease and much more willing to make my suggestion or to contribute something. And that way actually can help everybody feel empowered to use their voice, to have their say and make a contribution to the conversation. So it really means that we're asking open questions. So trying to avoid the yes, no answers, trying to avoid, well, what do we read about when we're in chapter 22 of Revelation? Can somebody tell me? Because we're making it instantly perhaps just a little bit more stressful and difficult for people to participate. But we can ask questions such as, I wonder what this makes you think of. I wonder what you think God is saying about this, or what strikes you in this passage, or what do you notice? These are great questions which help everybody to engage, everybody to start to think and wonder together. And actually we have more fruitful conversations, we do better learning, we go away with a better understanding if we've had a chance to engage in that way. Now, I asked you earlier to get a glass of water, so I hope that you grabbed one. I've got one here. And we're going to do an activity now, a prayer activity, which you'll find in the booklet. So when you get your copy, or if you have it there, you can obviously follow along. And we're looking at verse 17. I'm going to read this verse in a moment. I'll read it through once, and I would invite you to just listen to the words. And then I'll read it through again, and every time I say the word come, I would like you to take a sip of your glass of water. So we're going to spend a few moments now, as we're coming in towards the end of this session, in prayer and reflecting on what the words mean to us. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let everyone who hears say, come. And let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes take the water of life as a gift. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let everyone who hears say, come. And let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes take the water of life as a gift. Amen. When we've spent time together learning, when we've been encountering God, when we've been tuning into God in our group, in our service, in our act of worship together, it's really helpful to have something to take away. So we've got something to offer everyone, which can be an act, a response to whatever it is that we've been looking at. And so on each of the 4 weeks of all age resource in Revelation, there are what we've called Let's Act activities. And these are really great ideas that you can use for follow-up with people of different ages, because they help the conversation carry on. They help us have that conversation in our homes, with our families, in our households, with other people, perhaps in our church groups, whether we're perhaps meeting in the week for coffee. All kinds of suggestions which mean that what we've done together on a Sunday or at some point during the week continue to be part of our walk with Jesus. So the idea for week 4 is to go for a walk around your local area, or you can imagine that you're walking around. And it asks you to see glimpses of hope. Where do you see those glimpses of hope as you're walking? And maybe you're noticing that there might be things that God is doing in the place where you live, where your church is, where you're gathering. And you notice God seems to be doing something here. How could my household, how could we as a church congregation join in with what God is doing? Now, if I was doing that with a congregation setting in a Sunday service, I might print off some A3 size maps of our local community. I might invite people to find where they live. I could put this on a big screen for everybody to look at and then just talk to the person next to you. Can you find your street, your house? Can you find your friend's house? And so that we all have a sense of where we are in space in terms of our locality. And then as we do that work of kind of looking at where we are, that we're able then to think about, okay, who are the other people in this place? And we're bringing those to mind. So if we go for a walk, and this could be something that you do after today's event, you might want to go out this afternoon and stretch your legs after you've been on screen. You could go for a walk in your neighbourhood and think about who are the people and places here that I want to bring to mind if I'm thinking about that water as the gift of life. Who would it be great to give this gift of life to? How could I help in the place where I live? So there's something for you to follow up at some point this week. Maybe jot it down, put a reminder on your fridge as something that you can do in order to just help you remember all the things that we have been talking about today. It's been really great to share with you the resource that is in the Bible Month book. There's such a wealth of material there for you to use. Do encourage you to use it in all kinds of interesting, flexible, creative ways, and just to see how people of different ages are able to engage with what's there. I'm just going to close by telling you about a couple of things. So some of you may already know about 3Generate, the Children and Youth Assembly of the Methodist Church. It takes place at the NEC in Birmingham and will be happening again this year between the 6th to the 8th of October. So if you know that there are children and young people in your church, in your circuit, you might want to think about how could I bring them and we can go and be a part of 3Generate together, because we're really encouraging churches to think about the importance of what it means to gather and how wonderful it is to be that great big youthful community over the course of the weekend. But there's a little known secret about 3Generate, which is when you're on the team, there are usually about 250 folk who help make 3Generate happen as volunteers, that actually we get really blessed by everything that happens during the course of the weekend. And volunteers of all ages say, actually, I worked really hard, I had a great weekend, but I came away with so much more than I felt that I gave in the first place. So do check out our volunteering page. You can find it on methodist.org.uk/3genvols. And there's all kinds of information there about ways to volunteer, the different roles that we have, the different kind of ways that you can get involved. There will be something to suit everyone. So whether or not you want to be really active and out and about, part of the night steward team, if you'd rather be doing something quieter, to be sat down, maybe doing something in reception or registration, there will always be something that you can do. And we would love you to come and join this fabulous community in October. And then finally, if you're interested to know more about being an intergenerational church, there is a chapter in my book, The Essential Guide to Family Ministry. You can find out more there about what it means to be a church that strategically engages with people of all ages, as well as other ways to work with families and households. And at the moment, I think we're really crucially aware that we're in some very tough times, and families are really looking for help and support, and our churches can be really brilliant at stepping into the gap that exists for lots of them. It's been great to be with you. Have a really great rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Gail, for everything that you've just given to us. All age worship is a particular thing that I just love. I love the creativity. And as Gail says, the booklet comes with so many ideas. So you might not be somebody like me that has imagination and creativity coming out of us. And actually, it's a great starting point. But for those of us like myself that do have that imagination, actually also it did give me more ideas, so that's good.
Excellent, win-win.
Win-win. We're aware that some of you are suffering technical problems. You may even be about 10 minutes behind us in live time, believe that or not. So you may be finishing a bit later, something to do with the streaming. It's a technical thing, and we're really, really sorry about that. But right now, I think we're going to have a break and then watch the notification on your screen for how long that break will be. And we'll be back with Lawrence Waring from a real treat in store for session 4. We have the legend that is Lawrence Waring, who basically, for those who don't know, he is a walking thesaurus of all things songs and hymns, and yeah, he's the editor for Singing the Faith, and just somebody who can bring to the tapestry of today that in-depth knowledge of the songs and hymns that we sing week in, week out. So, over to you, Lawrence.
Okay. Hello, my name is Lawrence Waring. Really happy to be joining you. I'm joining you from Edinburgh. I'm editor of the website Singing the Faith Plus, which was set up 11 years ago to support and complement the hymn book Singing the Faith when it was first published, and I've been working on it ever since with others. And the range of resources on Singing the Faith is pretty huge if you haven't explored it. And it covers everything from lectionary suggestions each week, which is very popular, to broader resources, including for Bible Month. I've been really privileged to be able to support the work of Bible Month this year by thinking about some of the hymns and songs and music that reflect Revelation and can be used when we are thinking and singing and worshiping around the book of Revelation. So my aim in this session is twofold, is to encourage us all to think imaginatively about the hymns and music we use to support Bible Month. And it's to introduce the Singing the Faith hymn resource for the book of Revelation, which is online, and we'll point you to that later on. The hymn resource ties in really closely with the toolkit produced by Michael and the Bible Month team, in particular the weekly study sessions written by Dr. Helen Miller. The themes of the resource match those of Helen's sessions, so they'll be recognizable to you. The idea is to come to the book of Revelation through the hymns and songs we sing, which has been my own journey over the past few months, because Revelation wasn't a book I knew very well. Many of you will know it an awful lot better than I did when I started out. So I'm sharing a little of what I've discovered and about how we can explore and use the hymns in lots of practical ways. By the end of the session, I hope we will have identified the range of themes in the hymns in the resource, named some of the contexts in which the hymns can be used, and explored imaginative ways of using the hymns. And just to say, I'll mention several hymns and songs as we go along, but don't worry if you don't catch them all, because they're all listed in the resource. And as I say, I'll remind you at the end where that can be found. So, singing Revelation. Okay, because this wonderful little title from a blog post, the Book of Revelation is a musical, which I loved. And it's a really thoughtful post by a guy called Derek Demars about the Book of Revelation. And I can exactly see why he asks that question. There's a huge amount of singing that goes on in Revelation. In the hymn resource, we've identified 11 verses or passages that we are told are sung by angels, by elders, by the company of heaven. But there are many, many other references to singing and praising or calling for praise in the book of Revelation. The hymn expert in the States, Paul Westermeyer, he has a lovely phrase. He calls Revelation a huge hymn festival with a revealing landscape. And that musical landscape has influenced our hymns and worship traditions ever since Revelation was written down. Revelation, I realize, pervades our praise, how we praise, what we sing. And that's from the cotton fields and slaves of Southern America to the praise bands of Hillsong and our own local churches. I discovered that in the very first Methodist hymn collection, there's your factlet for the day, that was published in 1780, it has been calculated that there are at least 130 allusions to Revelation in only 525 hymns. Daniel Mount has assembled a list of 107 gospel songs based on or drawing on the 13 first chapters of Revelation, and we refer to some other lists in our resource as well. The hymns that are sung in the book of Revelation are both front and center of our praise and worship now, and present as an underlying source. So there are hymns and songs where you can hear and we repeat the words of Revelation. A really obvious one is Holy, Holy, Holy. Singing the Faith, number 11, is one version of that hymn, Reginald Heber's hymn, Holy, 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 which was originally written for Trinity Sunday and directly quotes Revelation 4, verses 8 to 11. But there are 5 other hymns in Singing the Faith that also begin Holy, Holy, Holy. So there are these direct references, but also these hymns in Revelation underlie a lot of the other things we sing. Sometimes that's reasonably obvious. So if you sing something like Praise to the Holiest in the Height, or Come, let us join our cheerful songs with angels round the throne, we are being the elders of Revelation. But there are other hymns as well where that influence isn't perhaps quite so obvious. One I like to talk about is Come, you thankful people, come. And people say, but that's a harvest hymn. That's all about bringing in the sheaves. And yes, it is. But actually, when you read the words, you realize it's rather more than that. When you read the words, even so, Lord, quickly come, bring our harvest home. Gather all your people in, free from sorrow, free from sin. We are in the world of Revelation. We are singing the hopes of Revelation. And it's true also in a lot of our Advent hymns, which are pursuing or exploring the theme of waiting and hoping. So I would encourage you, I mean, we've named a few Advent hymns in our resource, but I would encourage you at any time of the year, if you're looking at Revelation, go to the section in the hymn book about Advent or other books which just have hymns about Advent and see what those hymns and songs say about Revelation. Also, in Singing the Faith, the Gathering in God's Presence section, which is right near the beginning of the book, gathering in God's presence. Because isn't that what Revelation is all about? I was at a meeting just this last week, and the person who was chairing the meeting started it with a hymn I didn't really know. Jesus, lead us to the Father by your Spirit. And I thought, my goodness, we're in the world of Revelation. So we're already discovering, as we have done throughout today already, that there is a wide range of themes and concerns that spill out of the book of Revelation. And we can echo these in the hymns and the songs and the music we choose. So I want to say something about the range of themes. And I've mentioned holy, holy, holy. And there are these wonderful hymns and songs of praise, some of which, you know, I've kind of mentioned in our resource, but you will have others that are familiar to you in your context. And it'll vary, you know, whether you are used to having the accompaniment of a piano or an organ, or whether you are used to having the accompaniment of and the leadership of a praise band or a lead singer, for example. And the kinds of songs and hymns that we use in those different kind of settings does vary. But holy, holy, holy praise songs, they're right there front and center if we are thinking about the themes that come through the book of Revelation, or an adoration. But also there are other themes of hope, of witness, of perseverance, and of judgment. We've heard about the world the early Christian communities lived in, and there are experiences there that we've heard about in that oppressive Roman world that don't feel a million miles away all the time from the world we live in ourselves, and the experiences of our brothers and sisters around the world today. What's it like when our world or society doesn't seem to match up to God's dream for us and the world? One of the things we heard earlier was about how Revelation is a political document. It demands we engage with the political and social issues around us, confess our part in the issues and the things that go wrong in the world around us. And Revelation encourages us to sing about that. Another American theologian, Don Saliers, he has a lovely phrase as well. He says, there's no doxology without lament. No doxology without lament. And what does he mean by that? He means there's no rejoicing in God's vision for us without realizing that it is inextricably bound up with cries of lament and calls for justice. Those three things, they go together. You hear that in, for example, the Black American traditions of spirituals and blues, which reflect a struggle for survival and speak of judgment and reckoning. And we can sing what it feels like from our own hymn book. We can sing what it feels like to feel that God is not there. Sometimes there's a wonderful hymn by John Bell and Graham Mole which explores that idea that sometimes we may feel that God is not there, but God acts even though we think God may not be there. We can sing of the great darkness that covers the earth, oppression, justice, and pain. We can sing that with Gerald Coates and Noel Richards in their hymn. We may need to admit that, Father, we have sinned in word and deed and thought, and Stuart Townend and Keith Getty, and need to relearn the art of speaking with the accent of God's love, which is a line from an older, more traditional, but very familiar hymn, Lord, your church on earth is seeking your renewal from above. So there are these themes of justice, of lament, and of confession that are all present in the book of Revelation. And we have the opportunity to sing that in our worship at the same time as studying the book of Revelation through the study materials that have been put together for Bible Month. Other themes too: comfort and hope. Soon, and very soon, we are going to see the King. That's a kind of a gospel hymn which we point to. It's not in Singing the Faith, but we point to from our resource, and you can go and hear it on YouTube or in some other way. Great gospel hymn, one that's in the book. It is God who holds the nations in the hollow of his hand. These are hymns and songs of hope and comfort. And in the hymn, there is a new heaven, which is right out of the book of Revelation. Ruth Duck describes a society in which, she says, distinctions, divisions which hurt and destroy will all disappear. I think it is extraordinary, actually, how a good hymn or songwriter can take all those words from Revelations, home in on perhaps one part of them, and distill them into the words and the verses of a hymn. In our singing and our music, we can embrace the praise of the angels and the elders of Revelation. We can sing John's vision into being. We can sing holy, holy, holy in all different styles and versions we can find, but we are also called to sing that vision. Revelation reminds us worship can and should be core to our witness in the world, including a proclamation of how we interact with the world, not just on Sunday, but every day, living kingdom values, just as John demanded of the Christian communities he was writing to, looking to the future by acting in the present. Come thou long expected Jesus. There you go. That's an Advent hymn. Let's think about singing that in the middle of the year if we're looking at the book of Revelation. I want to ask a question which may sound kind of really obvious, but I think it's just worth spending a few moments thinking about. And that's, where might we use these hymns? We've explored, we've talked about the different themes, the range of themes, the subject matter of these hymns and songs that are about praise, but more than praise. Where might we use them? How might the book of Revelation pervade our worship and reflection during Bible Month? How might we mirror John's vision of heaven, reenacting it in church and community life? Well, in worship, obviously, that is a context where I would hope we were using hymns and songs in some shape or form. And a worship series may be something you're thinking of during the 30 days or so that you are looking at the book of Revelation. You may have Bible studies that you want to line up. So might what you're talking about during the week be reflected in your worship on a Sunday? And some of the hymns that we're suggesting alongside those themes might be useful to you when you're planning that worship. So worship will be one context in which we'll explore singing Revelation. But there are others where 2 or 3 are gathered. It doesn't have to be in a church building. It doesn't have to be in the sanctuary. It doesn't have to be with lots of people around you singing, or even just a few people singing around you in worship. Hymns can be sung in any context. And small group gatherings are one of those. And if you're nervous about singing in a rather small group, feel a little bit kind of exposed, which is completely understandable, then consider the idea you don't actually have to sing. You don't have to kind of say, oh, I can't sing, I'm tone deaf. Doesn't matter. The words are there. And the words are really helpful to us. Take an opportunity to read a hymn with each other. maybe take a verse each, pass it round, or if someone doesn't want to read, then just allow the next person to read. It is quite often the case that on a Sunday we sing a hymn and we maybe get caught up with a really good tune, and you get to the end of the hymn and think, oh, I haven't actually paid a whole lot of attention to the words. Whereas if in a small group you read carefully a hymn and maybe pause a little bit afterwards just to reflect on what you have read, then there may be something that pops out of the words that you haven't caught before. It's an opportunity to actually dig deep into some of these texts. An alternative will be not to read, but to listen to a recording of a hymn. I mentioned already the kind of YouTube links that we've been kind of discovering, and there are so many more of really interesting performances in worship or not in worship of some of these contemporary and gospel hymns in particular, which would be a lovely way to open or close a Bible study, for example. Have you thought about using hymns in business meetings? We hopefully set our meetings, any meetings, church meetings, in the context of worshiping God. And very likely, if you've been part of a church meeting or a church meeting, you've probably opened and perhaps closed as well with prayer. During Bible month, why not choose a hymn to sing or listen to that ties in with the book of Revelation, so that through these hymns, through these songs, we actually tie in everything we're doing to our inspection, our discovery of the book of Revelation. You might want to do this on your own, personal reflection. And there are many ways you might do this. One really simple idea is to choose a different hymn each day as part of your personal devotion. In the Singing the Faith resource for Bible month, we suggested around a dozen different hymns and songs per week, plus another 11 that reflect the overall mix of themes in the book. So there's plenty to choose from. You won't run out. And if you kind of think, oh, I might look somewhere else for some other hymns, do it, because there's lots of resource out there which might help you find new hymns and songs, new takes on the book of Revelation. And finally, another way of using the hymns and songs that we've been talking about, hymns can be a way into talking about Revelation. It's been my experience over the last few months, because as I said, I didn't know the book of Revelation very well, but I found I did know more hymns and songs that I had thought, which are inspired by the book of Revelation. Now, this isn't for everybody, but where your congregation or music group have favorite hymns or songs that either directly quote passages from Revelation or touch on its themes, maybe it's an opportunity for you to say in a sermon or a meeting or a group discussion, did you know? May I introduce you to St. John the Divine? You probably know him better than you thought, which I think is maybe, and I hope, the experience that many of us are discovering today. A final question. So, we've talked about the context in which you might use hymns. How might you use those hymns other than just singing? And I don't want to spend a long time on this, because I'm sure you will have ideas of your own, but it's worth thinking about hymns used in different ways. So hymns as prayers, for example, and we've touched on this already in a way by saying you don't actually have to sing a prayer. You can say a prayer, or you could sing a prayer sing a hymn as a prayer. There are lots of ways of using hymns. One of the sections on Singing the Faith Plus, the website, we have a whole kind of section about hymns as prayers. Just go to the website and and look on the top menu, and you'll find prayer in worship. And if you drop down, there's a section about hymns as prayer. And one of the resources that has been put together for that is just some simple prayer ideas for use in worship. So singing as prayer, spoken hymns as prayer, and you might do that as a group. You might do that with someone just speaking a hymn from the front, or if you have a hymn with a refrain, you can kind of alternate between someone leading and people responding. Similarly, you can use maybe just a phrase from a hymn to sing in response to a prayer. So maybe we have a hymn of praise which you invite people to respond to sections of that prayer with a version of Holy, 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 which I go back to, but it's one that we are familiar with. Another way of using hymns as prayer is actually only to listen to the music, to settle and reflect and spend a bit of time of quiet with the music of a hymn which we may remember echoes the kind of the atmosphere, the messages of Revelation, and allow those messages to just percolate and enter into our thought and prayer. While we were listening to ways of using the resources, the Bible Month resources for all age worship, one of the things we said was, yes, we do tend to use quite a lot of words in our worship, which means that someone's speaking and everyone else is just listening. So it's quite a lot of listening. So maybe there are less wordy ways of using hymns, less just listening or just singing. Praying with your senses, building a prayer can. These are ideas on the Singing the Faith Plus website, and might tie into how you reflect on some of the messages and some of the hymns that reflect those messages in Revelation. Some other ways in which you might use hymns, not just for singing straight through. So hymns as prayers is one. Hymns as confirmation, conversation and affirmation. What do I mean by that? Have you ever had the experience of having a group of people together and asking the group to kind of divide down the middle and face each other? And maybe share the singing of a hymn from one side to the other, so that we are both singing and worshipping, but also having a conversation through a hymn. Hymns that include a question are a really good way of doing that. So, for example, imagine two sides of a congregation or a group divided into two, facing each other and taking a line each of the hymn which begins, "How shall I sing that majesty which angels do admire?" Taking a couple of lines each. So one side sings, asks the question, "How shall I sing that majesty which angels do admire?" And the other side replies and affirms, "Let dust in dust and silence lie. Sing, sing, ye heavenly choir." And the first side responds, "Thousands of thousands stand around thy throne, O God most high." And the second side echoes, 10,000 times, 10,000 times sound thy praise." And then they ask another question, "But who am I?" And so through these words of Revelation, or based on the book of Revelation, we have an opportunity to have conversation, to affirm each other's faith, to respond to each other's questions in faith. You might also want to use hymns as springboards. Find a hymn inspired by Revelation and ask how it speaks to our society now. Use that as the start of a Bible study, for example. Ask people to choose a hymn based on the book of Revelation from the list maybe that we've compiled. bring it to your group and say what that says to them about the demands and the challenges and the hopes of Revelation, and how they might wish to respond in action, in a practical way, to that hymn. And you may actually want to go back to the hymns in Revelation itself. I mentioned those 11 hymns, which are more than punctuation marks. Work through them one by one. Ask how they express the action going on around them in the book. What has just happened that leads to this hymn? What happens next in response to that hymn? So to conclude, Revelation strikes me is a template for praise. It provides the bedrock examples of how we sing our praise to God in a similar way to the Lord's Prayer for our spoken prayer. When he offered his disciples that prayer, Jesus wasn't saying you must always use these exact words. These are nothing else. He was saying, pray like this. Here are the key themes. This is how you relate to God, your creator and companion. And Revelation does something similar around worship and singing. Here are the key themes. This is how you relate to God, your creator and constant companion and guide. Paul Westermer, who I referred to earlier, says that Revelation not only supplies the key imagery for the hymns that we sing, but they inspire worship and they inspire hope. He says that these hymns enables the worship depicted in Revelation to inspire the worship within the gathered community, our gathered communities, inspiring hope in various social contexts, including those characterized by grief and injustice, which is a remarkable gift to us, as it was to the people John was writing to in the first place. One last little quote before I finish. I want to say Victorian hymn writer and poet Christina Rossetti referred to Revelation as showing us that heaven is revealed to earth as the homeland of music. I love that phrase. We could probably spend a long time working out exactly what she meant by that, but it reminds me of our question right at the beginning. Book of Revelation is a musical? Well, I hope maybe in some of the things I've shared, you get some sense of, yes, it is a musical. It's a homeland of music, but it's a springboard for our own music, our own singing, in which we can witness and reflect the messages and the themes of the book of Revelation. I've mentioned the hymn resource just to say that it is available. You can find it in several ways. You can find it by going to the Singing the Faith Plus website and searching for Bible Month 2023. Bible Month or just Revelation, put it in the search box and you'll come up with the resource. But you'll also find it linked to from the Bible Month page on the Methodist website. So I hope you get a chance to use it, to explore it, that it's useful to you, and that if you have other ideas, other hymns, other songs that you think be worth sharing, please get in touch via the website. There's a email address there, and let us know. We'll share those ideas as people kind of get to grips with Bible Month this year and start singing their way through the book of Revelation. Thanks very much indeed.
Oh, thank you so much. Lawrence, oh my gosh, did I not tell you? That guy's a legend, isn't he? He totally knows his stuff. But the way that he communicates it just enthuses us all to better use the hymns and songs that are available to us. I don't know about my co-presenters on this bit, but actually the artwork as well. That was fantastic. A really engaging session. Can I just remind you that all the sessions are going to be re-available on the YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And I think, well, I'm certainly going to be watching them back to see the bits that perhaps hasn't quite gone in. So there's one for you. But we are going to land our time together today by asking a few more questions of our contributors, and I'm joined by Gail and Michael. Thank you guys for joining me. It's been a great day.
It's been a tremendous day.
I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed myself. I love talking about the Bible.
Michael, you're still very enthusiastic and energetic. That's good. That's good, because we've got some really, really cracking questions.
Okay.
But I think I'm going to go to Gail first with the first one. I'm just going to let you stew there for a bit, Michael. Gail, we've had some questions about the use of this material, perhaps with the under 5. So we're told all the time that your brain develops mostly before the age of 5. So it's really important in the church to be using this material constructively, I guess, with the under 5s. So how would you be using it?
I think that's wonderful. I love the idea of churches exploring Revelation with under 5s. I mean, I don't think you would necessarily put those things together at first if you were perhaps planning something. But I think lots of the activities that we've included are really accessible and actually give lots of space just for conversation. So actually, often what's really lovely with under 5s is that you're engaged in an activity. So maybe that river activity, if you're actually able to put hands or feet into water, that you can have that sort of sensory conversation about the experience, which then gives us a chance to talk about God and our understanding of what it's like to encounter God. So I think lots of those things kind of offer that opportunity, and that's how we have to see them. I would also just add, though, that I think oftentimes as adults, we equally enjoy doing those things. So if it's something that maybe is messy, if it's something actually which is just a little bit different, which gets us out of our seats, gets us from being passive learners to being more active, engaged learners, they're really good for us. So I think there's opportunity actually for people of all ages. So I would be volunteering to go and do the stuff with under 5s, because then I get a chance to do it as well.
Oh, crumbs, Gail. I think you might be booked up a little bit much. But it's also about that modelling, isn't it? If we are active in our worship, little ones, reciprocally, we can model each other.
Yeah, and they're always watching us. They're always observing what we do. They're glancing and sort of trying to take in the way in which we go about doing things. So I think it's worth us being aware of that. And I think it's also worth us looking and seeing how those children respond, because sometimes there is awe and wonder in a young child's face and response that maybe as adults that we have forgotten, or we've kind of lost a sense of connection with. And so that can be a great nudge for us as adults as well. So we can learn stuff from each other.
No, that's really great stuff. And yeah, I'll be taking your number afterwards to book you for our church. Michael, Gail, either of you, we've had some questions about maybe other reading material or podcasts or YouTube films, or other stuff that we can engage with the topic of Revelation.
I mean, my first signpost would be to say in the booklet, we point to a wealth of kind of resources, as I say, of varying degrees of kind of accessibility. So everything from kind of the giant anchor translation and commentary by Craig Coaster to like much more accessible books. So there's a whole load of material in terms of reading. There's also, we signposted some small group material. I'm always a big advocate for the Bible Project and their theme videos and their kind of introduction to book videos. They've done some great stuff on Revelation there. And you can listen to their podcast series as well. I don't know if they've done any podcasts specifically about Revelation. If you want more of me, there's a short YouTube video series of YouTube videos of me interviewing a chap called Ian Paul, who's probably one of the UK's leading Revelation scholars. He's an Anglican lecturer, but if you search for curtain call Revelation Ian Paul, then you will find videos of me interviewing him in his lovely garden. So there is stuff out there, basically, but they would be the kind of starting points I point people towards.
Yeah, and I've certainly used the Bible Project before. It's an
really
amazing resource. Okay, so the next theme sort of comes from people asking questions about the new heaven and the new earth. So, Michael, why don't we start with you on, could you say something about the difference between the new heaven and the new earth, or is it actually just the same thing?
So what we seem to have in the language of Revelation 21 is John sees a new heaven and it comes down to earth. So the renewed heaven and the renewed earth are synonymous. They become the same place, basically. And that partly is because in the mindset of the biblical writers, heaven is up there, it's above the firmament. Think about creation. You know, the first thing that God does is he creates the heavens and the earth. There's a division there. And so the dramatic vision of Revelation 21 and 22 is the fact that they're no longer separated, that the presence of God is fully with humanity on earth. So the new heavens and the new earth is it's the same space. It's the space that's fully intertwined, fully overlapped. And just on the question of kind of resources around that, two great books I point you towards. They got referenced briefly earlier actually by Jasmine. Surprised by Hope by Tom Wright. Excellent book that talks about the understanding of new heaven, new earth, what happens when we die, resurrection, all that. And Paula Good has also written a book called Heaven, a Rough Guide, or it might just be Heaven. But that's a really super accessible little booklet as well, which I think talks about here's how the Bible understands the language of heaven and earth and angels and demons and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and actually a really good comparison, the two writers there on accessibility. Okay, so one for you, Gail, on that subject of the new heaven and the new earth. If there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, does that mean that we don't need to look after the old one?
Oh, crumbs. I mean, yes, we do need to look after it, I think is a pretty straightforward answer to that, because we are living here and now, and we are stewards of it in the best sense as God kind of created the world around us. And there's something about the way in which we live in God's creation which enables us to experience God, enables us to demonstrate and walk as God's people, actually, for the best of the rest of the world as well. So I don't think it's a case that we're kind of storing up for the future all of that we're living and walking in the reality of it now. So I don't think we can just kind of push all of that stuff aside and think actually we don't really need to care or think about it, because it really does have an impact on how people live today.
Yeah, and it's also a really strong theme and something that children and young people feel very passionate about, isn't it? So, yeah. Well, thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry that we haven't had time to cover all the questions. I hope your questions somehow have been held within what we've talked about in different ways. Thank you for your engagement today. But I'm just going to hand over to Michael to finish us off with some final thoughts of today, bring it all around to some kind of conclusion and to finish for us. Thanks, Michael.
No problem. Yeah, so I think a couple of things I just want to say in closing thoughts. The first would be that there is a wealth of resource that we've pulled together for you. So do check out methodist.org.uk/Bible month, where you can find things like the slides from today. You will be linked to a whole load of other resources that we are in the process of creating. So already up there, you can now download a journaling kit. If you want to try Bible journaling your way through Revelation, there's a journaling kit there for you to download and some videos on how to get into Bible journaling. We're producing a 30-day reading guide, so you can not just think about the text, but read your whole way through the book over the 30 days with an introduction to each day's reading. That's actually going to be available both as a download, but also you can order printed booklets for free from the Methodist Connection, and you can commit as a church, as a circuit, as a small group to work your way through those. So I'd encourage you to get ready to order those. I think the instructions of how to order them will be going up shortly. We're putting together some little animations, little 1-minute animations that introduce the themes for each week. They will be available hopefully in the next couple of months. So keep an eye on the website for those. You can also check out things like facebook.com/Bible month and youtube.com/Bible month, where notifications about this stuff will go live, as well as things like the animations will be stored on there. So do be in touch with us as well if you want to find out anything more, if you want to ask some more questions, etc. There's different ways you can get in contact. You can find things like our email addresses on the Methodist Church website, or you can contact Bible Month at methodistchurch.org.uk. Everything's Bible Monthy for obvious reasons. But hopefully this has been really helpful. Hopefully it's been really valuable to you and will serve you as you lead other people into what I think is actually a really fascinating, really relevant, really down-to-earth text that is full of inspiration and comfort for us as disciples. I think I'm just going to pray.
Yes, you are.
Great. Let's just hold a moment of silence, shall we? God, we are grateful that Revelation is all about you. Jesus, we're grateful that ultimately what that text wants to remind us of is that you are the one on the throne, that you are the one who has sovereignty and authority and power, that you are for us, that you are with us, that you want to speak to us in our lives, in our churches. You want to bring comfort and challenge. You want to bring encouragement and hope. And God, we're grateful that we are heading towards a vision of heaven established fully on earth, of you being fully present with your people, of every nation being healed, of the river of life flowing, of everyone having access to you, of the temple standing open, of encounter. God, I ask that we would experience a foretaste of that as we engage in Bible Month this year. May it be a time where we have you revealed to us in new ways. May it be a time where we discover more of you, not just in this text, but in the rest of your word as well. May it be a time where we grow in hope and anticipation and expectation of what it is that you are doing in our world and the world in which you are leading us towards. Ultimately, God, would you dispel the myths? Would you dispel the fear? And would you help us see you clearly face to face as the King of the universe, as the one who holds creation in your hands, as the one who lovingly is bringing history to your chosen conclusion. And may that be so uplifting for us. We love you, we're grateful to you and for you. And we just ask that your Spirit go with us as we explore, as we spend 30 days with Revelation.